by Leanne Howlett. The Lodger, by Marie Belloc Lowndes. Chapter 1. Lover and friend hast thou put far from me, and mine acquaintance into darkness. Psalm 88:18. Robert Bunting and Ellen his wife sat before their dully burning, carefully banked-up fire. The room, especially when it be known that it was part of a house standing in a grimy, if not exactly sordid, London thoroughfare, was exceptionally clean and well cared for. A casual stranger, more particularly one of a superior class to their own, on suddenly opening the door of that sitting-room, would have thought that Mr. and Mrs. Bunting presented a very pleasant, cosy picture of comfortable married life. Bunting, who was leaning back in a deep leather armchair, was clean-shaven and dapper, still in appearance what he had been for many years of his life, a self-respecting manservant. On his wife, now sitting up in an uncomfortable straight-backed chair, the marks of past servitude were less apparent, but they were there all the same, in her neat black stuff dress, and in her scrupulously clean, plain collar and cuffs. Mrs. Bunting, as a single woman, had been what is known as a useful maid. But peculiarly true of average English life is the time-worn English proverb as to appearances being deceitful. Mr. and Mrs. Bunting were sitting in a very nice room, and in their time, how long ago it now seemed, both husband and wife had been proud of their carefully chosen belongings. Everything in the room was strong and substantial, and each article of furniture had been bought at a well-conducted auction held in a private house. Thus, the red damask curtains, which now shut out the fog-laden, drizzling atmosphere of the Marylebone Road, had cost a mere song, and yet they might have been warranted to last another 30 years. A great bargain also had been the excellent Axminster carpet which covered the floor, as again the armchair in which Bunting now sat forward, staring into the dull, small fire. In fact, that armchair had been an extravagance of Mrs. Bunting. She had wanted her husband to be comfortable after the day's work was done, and she had paid 37 shillings for the chair. Only yesterday Bunting had tried to find a purchaser for it, but the man who had come to look at it, guessing their cruel necessities, had only offered them 12 shillings and sixpence for it. So for the present they were keeping their armchair. But man and woman want something more than mere material comfort, much as that is valued by the Buntings of this world. So, on the walls of the sitting-room, hung neatly framed, if now rather faded photographs of Mr. and Mrs. Bunting's various former employers, and of the pretty country houses in which they had separately lived during the long years they had spent in a not unhappy servitude. But appearances were not only deceitful, they were more than usually deceitful with regard to these unfortunate people. In spite of their good furniture, that substantial outward sign of respectability which is the last thing which wise folk who fall into trouble try to dispose of, they were almost at the end of their tether. Already they had learnt to go hungry, and they were beginning to learn to go cold. Tobacco, the last thing the sober man forgoes among his comforts, had been given up some time ago by Bunting. And even Mrs. Bunting, prim, prudent, careful woman as she was in her way, had realized what this must mean to him. So well, indeed, had she understood that some days back she had crept out and bought him a packet of Virginia. Bunting had been touched as he had not been for years by any woman's thought and love for him. Painful tears had forced themselves into his eyes, and husband and wife had both felt in their odd, unemotional way moved to the heart. Fortunately he never guessed—how could he have guessed with his slow, normal, rather dull mind—that his poor Ellen had since more than once bitterly regretted that fourpence halfpenny, for they were now very near the soundless depths which divide those who dwell on the safe table-land of security, those, that is, who are sure of making a respectable, if not a happy living, and the submerged multitude who, through some lack in themselves, or owing to the conditions under which our strange civilization has become organized, struggle rudderless till they die in workhouse, hospital, or prison. Had the Buntings been in a class lower than their own, had they belonged to the great company of human beings technically known to so many of us as the poor, there would have been friendly neighbors ready to help them, and the same would have been the case had they belonged to the class of smug, well-meaning, if unimaginative, folk whom they had spent so much of their lives in serving. There was only one person in the world who might possibly be brought to help them. That was an aunt of Bunting's first wife. With this woman, the widow of a man who had been well-to-do, lived Daisy, Bunting's only child by his first wife, and during the last long 2 days he had been trying to make up his mind to write to the old lady, and that though he suspected that she would almost certainly retort with a cruel, sharp rebuff. As to their few acquaintances, former fellow-servants and so on, they had gradually fallen out of touch with them. There was but one friend who often came to see them in their deep trouble. This was a young fellow named Chandler, under whose grandfather Bunting had been footman years and years ago. Joe Chandler had never gone into service. He was attached to the police. In fact, not to put too fine a point upon it, young Chandler was a detective. When they had first taken the house, which had brought them, so they both thought, such bad luck, Bunting had encouraged the young chap to come often, for his tales were well worth listening to, quite exciting at times. But now poor Bunting didn't want to hear that sort of stories of people being cleverly nabbed, or stupidly allowed to escape the fate they always, from Chandler's point of view, richly deserved. But Joe still came very faithfully once or twice a week, so timing his calls that neither host nor hostess need press food upon him. Nay, more, he had done that which showed him to have a good and feeling heart. He had offered his father's old acquaintance a loan, and Bunting, at last, had taken 30 shillings. Very little of that money now remained. Bunting still could jingle a few coppers in his pocket, and Mrs. Bunting had 2 shillings 9 pence. That, and the rent they would have to pay in 5 weeks, was all they had left. Everything of the light, portable sort that would fetch money had been sold. Mrs. Bunting had a fierce horror of the pawn-shop. She had never put her feet in such a place, and she declared she never would. She would rather starve first. But she had said nothing when there had occurred the gradual disappearance of various little possessions she knew that Bunting valued, notably of the old-fashioned gold watch chain which had been given to him after the death of his first master, a master he had nursed faithfully and kindly through a long and terrible illness. There had also vanished a twisted gold tie-pin and a large mourning ring, both gifts of former employers. When people are living near that deep pit which divides the secure from the insecure, when they see themselves creeping closer and closer to its dread edge, they are apt, however loquacious by nature, to fall into long silences. Bunting had always been a talker, but now he talked no more. Neither did Mrs. Bunting, but then she had always been a silent woman, and that was perhaps one reason why Bunting had felt drawn to her from the very first moment he had seen her. It had fallen out in this way. A lady had just engaged him as butler, and he had been shown, by the man whose place he was to take, into the dining-room. There, to use his own expression, he had discovered Ellen Green, carefully pouring out the glass of port wine which her then mistress always drank at 11:30 every morning. And as he, the new butler, had seen her engaged in this task, as he had watched her carefully stopper the decanter and put it back into the old wine-cooler, he had said to himself, "That is the woman for me." But now her stillness, her dumbness, had got on the unfortunate man's nerves. He no longer felt like going into the various little shops close by, patronized by him in more prosperous days, and Mrs. Bunting also went afield to make the slender purchases which still had to be made every day or two, if they were to be saved from actually starving to death. Suddenly, across the stillness of the dark November evening, there came the muffled sounds of hurrying feet and of loud, shrill shouting outside, boys crying the late afternoon editions of the evening papers. Bunting turned uneasily in his chair. The giving up of a daily paper had been, after his tobacco, his bitterest deprivation, and the paper was an older habit than the tobacco, for servants are great readers of newspapers. As the shouts came through the closed windows and the thick damask curtains, Bunting felt a sudden sense of mind-hunger fall upon him. It was a shame, a damned shame, that he shouldn't know what was happening in the world outside. Only criminals are kept from hearing news of what is going on beyond their prison walls, and those shouts, those hoarse, sharp cries must portend that something really exciting had happened, something warranted to make a man forget for the moment his own intimate, gnawing troubles. He got up, and going towards the nearest window, strained his ears to listen. There fell on them, emerging now and again from the confused babble of hoarse shouts, the one clear word, "Murder." Slowly Bunting's brain pieced the loud, indistinct cries into some sort of connected order. Yes, that was it. Horrible murder. Murder at St. Pancras. Bunting remembered vaguely another murder which had been committed near St. Pancras, that of an old lady by her servant-maid. It had happened a great many years ago, but was still vividly remembered, as of special and natural interest among the class to which he had belonged. The newsboys, for there were more than one of them, a rather unusual thing in the Marylebone Road, were coming nearer and nearer. Now they had adopted another cry, but he could not quite catch what they were crying. They were still shouting hoarsely, excitedly, but he could only hear a word or two now and then. Suddenly, the Avenger at his work again, broke on his ear. During the last fortnight 4 very curious and brutal murders had been committed in London and within a comparatively small area. The first had aroused no special interest. Even the second had only been awarded, in the paper Bunting was still then taking in, quite a small paragraph. Then had come the third, and with that a wave of keen excitement, for pinned to the dress of the victim, a drunken woman, had been found a 3-cornered piece of paper, on which was written, in red ink and in printed characters, the words, "The Avenger." It was then realized, not only by those whose business it is to investigate such terrible happenings, but also by the vast world of men and women who take an intelligent interest in such sinister mysteries, that the same miscreant had committed all 3 crimes, and before that extraordinary fact had had time to soak well into the public mind, there took place yet another murder, and again the murderer had been to special pains to make it clear that some obscure and terrible lust for vengeance possessed him. Now everyone was talking of the Avenger and his crimes. Even the man who left their ha'porth of milk at the door each morning had spoken to Bunting about them that very day. Bunting came back to the fire and looked down at his wife with mild excitement. Then, seeing her pale, apathetic face, her look of weary, mournful absorption, a wave of irritation swept through him. He felt he could have shaken her. Ellen had hardly taken the trouble to listen when he, Bunting, had come back to bed that morning, and told her what the milkman had said. In fact, she had been quite nasty about it, intimating that she didn't like hearing about such horrid things. It was a curious fact that though Mrs. Bunting enjoyed tales of pathos and sentiment, and would listen with frigid amusement to the details of a breach of promise action, she shrank from stories of immorality or physical violence. In the old happy days, when they could afford to buy a paper, aye, and more than one paper daily, Bunting had often had to choke down his interest in some exciting case or mystery which was affording him pleasant mental relaxation, because any allusion to it sharply angered Ellen. But now he was at once too dull and too miserable to care how she felt. Walking away from the window, he took a slow, uncertain step towards the door. When there he turned half round, and there came over his close-shaven, round face the rather sly, pleading look with which a child about to do something naughty glances at its parent. But Mrs. Bunting remained quite still. Her thin, narrow shoulders just showed above the back of the chair on which she was sitting, bolt upright, staring before her as if into vacancy. Bunting turned round, opened the door, and quickly he went out into the dark hall. They had given up lighting the gas there some time ago, and opened the front door. Walking down the small flagged path outside, he flung open the iron gate which gave on to the damp pavement. But there he hesitated. The coppers in his pocket seemed to have shrunk in number, and he remembered ruefully how far Ellen could make even 4 pennies go. Then a boy ran up to him with a sheaf of evening papers, and Bunting, being sorely tempted, fell. "Give me a Sun," he said roughly, "Sun or Echo." But the boy, scarcely stopping to take breath, shook his head. "Only penny papers left," he gasped. "What'll you 'ave, sir?" With an eagerness which was mingled with shame, Bunting drew a penny out of his pocket and took a paper, it was the Evening Standard, from the boy's hand. Then very slowly he shut the gate and walked back through the raw, cold air up the flagged path, shivering yet full of eager, joyful anticipation. Thanks to that penny he had just spent so recklessly, he would pass a happy hour, taken for once out of his anxious, despondent, miserable self. It irritated him shrewdly to know that these moments of respite from carking care would not be shared with his poor wife, with careworn, troubled Ellen. A hot wave of unease, almost of remorse, swept over Bunting. Ellen would never have spent that penny on herself. He knew that well enough. And if it hadn't been so cold, so foggy, so drizzly, he would have gone out again through the gate and stood under the street lamp to take his pleasure. He dreaded with a nervous dread the glance of Ellen's cold, reproving, light blue eyes. That glance would tell him that he had no business to waste a penny on a paper, and that well he knew it. Suddenly the door in front of him opened, and he heard a familiar voice saying crossly yet anxiously, "What on earth are you doing out there, Bunting? Come in, do. You'll catch your death of cold. I don't want to have you ill on my hands as well as everything else." Mrs. Bunting rarely uttered so many words at once nowadays. He walked in through the front door of his cheerless house. "I went out to get a paper," he said sullenly. After all, he was master. He had as much right to spend the money as she had. For the matter of that, the money on which they were now both living had been lent, nay, pressed on him, not on Ellen, by that decent young chap, Joe Chandler. And he, Bunting, had done all he could. He had pawned everything he could pawn, while Ellen, so he resentfully noticed, still wore her wedding ring. He stepped past her heavily, and though she said nothing, he knew she grudged him his coming joy. Then, full of rage with her and contempt for himself, and giving himself the luxury of a very mild oath, Ellen had very early made it clear she would have no swearing in her presence, he lit the hall gas full flare. "How can we hope to get lodgers if they can't even see the card?" he shouted angrily. And there was truth in what he said, for now that he had lit the gas, the oblong card, though not the word apartments printed on it, could be plainly seen outlined against the old-fashioned fanlight above the front door. Bunting went into the sitting-room, silently followed by his wife, and then, sitting down in his nice armchair, he poked the little banked-up fire. It was the first time Bunting had poked the fire for many a long day, and this exertion of marital authority made him feel better. A man has to assert himself sometimes, and he, Bunting, had not asserted himself enough lately. A little colour came into Mrs. Bunting's pale face. She was not used to be flouted in this way, for Bunting, when not thoroughly upset, was the mildest of men. She began moving about the room, flicking off an imperceptible touch of dust here, straightening a piece of furniture there. But her hands trembled. They trembled with excitement, with self-pity, with anger. A penny? It was dreadful, dreadful to have to worry about a penny. But they had come to the point when one has to worry about pennies. Strange that her husband didn't realize that. Bunting looked round once or twice. He would have liked to ask Ellen to leave off fidgeting, but he was fond of peace and perhaps by now a little bit ashamed of himself, so he refrained from remark, and she soon gave over what irritated him of her own accord. But Mrs. Bunting did not come and sit down as her husband would have liked her to do. The sight of him, absorbed in his paper as he was, irritated her and made her long to get away from him. Opening the door which separated the sitting-room from the bedroom behind, and, shutting out the aggravating vision of Bunting sitting comfortably by the now brightly burning fire, with the Evening Standard spread out before him, she sat down in the cold darkness and pressed her hands against her temples. Never, never had she felt so hopeless, so broken as now. Where was the good of having been an upright, conscientious, self-respecting woman all her life long, if it only led to this utter, degrading poverty and wretchedness? She and Bunting were just past the age which gentlefolk think proper in a married couple seeking to enter service together, unless, that is, the wife happens to be a professed cook. A cook and a butler can always get a nice situation. But Mrs. Bunting was no cook. She could do all right the simple things any lodger she might get would require, but that was all. Lodgers? How foolish she had been to think of taking lodgers, for it had been her doing. Bunting had been like butter in her hands. Yet they had begun well, with a lodging-house in a seaside place. There they had prospered, not as they had hoped to do, but still pretty well, and then had come an epidemic of scarlet fever, and that had meant ruin for them, and for dozens, nay hundreds of other luckless people. Then had followed a business experiment which had proved even more disastrous, and which had left them in debt to an extent they could never hope to repay, to a good-natured former employer. After that, instead of going back to service, as they might have done, perhaps, either together or separately, they had made up their minds to make one last effort, and they had taken over, with the trifle of money that remained to them, the lease of this house in the Marylebone Road. In former days, when they had each been leading the sheltered, impersonal, and above all financially easy existence which is the compensation life offers to those men and women who deliberately take upon themselves the yoke of domestic service, they had both lived in houses overlooking Regent's Park. It had seemed a wise plan to settle in the same neighbourhood, the more so that Bunting, who had a good appearance, had retained the kind of connection which enables a man to get a job now and again as waiter at private parties. But life moves quickly, jaggedly, for people like the Buntings. Two of his former masters had moved to another part of London, and a caterer in Baker Street whom he had known went bankrupt. And now? Well, just now Bunting could not have taken a job had one been offered him, for he had pawned his dress clothes. He had not asked his wife's permission to do this, as so good a husband ought to have done. He had just gone out and done it. And she had not had the heart to say anything. Nay, it was with part of the money that he had handed her silently the evening he did it that she had bought that last packet of tobacco. And then, as Mrs. Bunting sat there thinking these painful thoughts, there suddenly came to the front door the sound of a loud, tremulous, uncertain double knock. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. Mrs. Bunting jumped nervously to her feet. She stood for a moment listening in the darkness, a darkness made the blacker by the line of light under the door behind which sat Bunting reading his paper. And then it came again, that loud, tremulous, uncertain double knock. Not a knock, so the listener told herself, that boded any good. Would-be lodgers gave sharp, quick, bold, confident raps. No, this must be some kind of beggar. The queerest people came at all hours, and asked, whining or threatening, for money. Mrs. Bunting had had some sinister experiences with men and women, especially women, drawn from that nameless, mysterious class made up of the human flotsam and jetsam which drifts about every great city. But since she had taken to leaving the gas in the passage unlit at night, she had been very little troubled with that kind of visitors, those human bats which are attracted by any kind of light, but leave alone those who live in darkness. She opened the door of the sitting-room. It was Bunting's place to go to the front door, but she knew far better than he did how to deal with difficult or obtrusive callers. Still, somehow, she would have liked him to go tonight. But Bunting sat on, absorbed in his newspaper. All he did at the sound of the bedroom door opening was to look up and say, "Didn't you hear a knock?" Without answering his question, she went out into the hall. Slowly she opened the front door. On the top of the 3 steps which led up to the door, there stood the long, lanky figure of a man, clad in an Inverness cape and an old-fashioned top hat. He waited for a few seconds, blinking at her, perhaps dazzled by the light of the gas in the passage. Mrs. Bunting's trained perception told her at once that this man, odd as he looked, was a gentleman, belonging by birth to the class with whom her former employment had brought her in contact. "Is it not a fact that you let lodgings?" he asked, and there was something shrill, unbalanced, hesitating in his voice. "Yes, sir," she said uncertainly. It was a long, long time since anyone had come after their lodgings, anyone, that is, that they could think of taking into their respectable house. Instinctively she stepped a little to one side, and the stranger walked past her, and so into the hall. And then, for the first time, Mrs. Bunting noticed that he held a narrow bag in his left hand. It was quite a new bag, made of strong brown leather. "I am looking for some quiet rooms," he said. Then he repeated the words, "quiet rooms," in a dreamy, absent way, and as he uttered them he looked nervously round him. Then his sallow face brightened, for the hall had been carefully furnished and was very clean. There was a neat hat and umbrella stand, and the stranger's weary feet fell soft on a good, serviceable, dark red drugget, which matched in colour the flock paper on the walls. A very superior lodging-house, this, and evidently a superior lodging-house keeper. "You'd find my rooms quite quiet, sir," she said gently, "and just now I have 4 to let. The house is empty save for my husband and me, sir." Mrs. Bunting spoke in a civil, passionless voice. It seemed too good to be true, this sudden coming of a possible lodger, and of a lodger who spoke in the pleasant, courteous way and voice which recalled to the poor woman her happy far-off days of youth and of security. "That sounds very suitable," he said. "4 rooms? Well, perhaps I ought only to take 2 rooms. But still, I should like to see all 4 before I make my choice." How fortunate, how very fortunate it was that Bunting had lit the gas! But for that circumstance this gentleman would have passed them by. She turned towards the staircase, quite forgetting in her agitation that the front door was still open, and it was the stranger whom she already in her mind described as the lodger, who turned and rather quickly walked down the passage and shut it. "Oh, thank you, sir," she exclaimed. "I'm sorry you should have had the trouble." For a moment their eyes met. "It's not safe to leave a front door open in London," he said, rather sharply. "I hope you do not often do that. It would be so easy for anyone to slip in." Mrs. Bunting felt rather upset. The stranger had still spoken courteously, but he was evidently very much put out. "I assure you, sir, I never leave my front door open," she answered hastily. "You needn't be at all afraid of that." And then, through the closed door of the sitting-room, came the sound of Bunting coughing. It was just a little hard cough, but Mrs. Bunting's future lodger started violently. "Who's that?" he said, putting out a hand and clutching her arm. "Whatever was that?" "Only my husband, sir. He went out to buy a paper a few minutes ago, and the cold just caught him, I suppose." "Your husband?" He looked at her intently, suspiciously. What may I ask is your husband's occupation?" Mrs. Bunting drew herself up. The question as to Bunting's occupation was no one's business but theirs. Still, it wouldn't do for her to show offence. "He goes out waiting," she said stiffly. "He was a gentleman's servant, sir. He could, of course, valet you should you require him to do so." And then she turned and led the way up the steep, narrow staircase. At the top of the first flight of stairs was what Mrs. Bunting, to herself, called the drawing-room floor. It consisted of a sitting-room in front, and a bedroom behind. She opened the door of the sitting-room and quickly lit the chandelier. This front room was pleasant enough, though perhaps a little over-encumbered with furniture. Covering the floor was a green carpet simulating moss. 4 chairs were placed round the table which occupied the exact middle of the apartment, and in the corner, opposite the door giving on to the landing, was a roomy, old-fashioned chiffonier. On the dark green walls hung a series of 8 engravings, portraits of early Victorian belles, clad in lace and tarleton ball dresses, clipped from an old book of beauty. Mrs. Bunting was very fond of these pictures. She thought they gave the drawing-room a note of elegance and refinement. As she hurriedly turned up the gas, she was glad indeed, that she had summoned up sufficient energy 2 days ago to give the room a thorough turn-out. It had remained for a long time in the state in which it had been left by its last dishonest, dirty occupants when they had been scared into going away by Bunting's rough threats of the police. But now it was in apple-pie order, with one paramount exception, of which Mrs. Bunting was painfully aware. There were no white curtains to the windows, but that omission could soon be remedied if this gentleman really took the lodgings. But what was this? The stranger was looking round him rather dubiously. "This is rather too grand for me," he said at last. "I should like to see your other rooms, Mrs. "Bunting," she said softly. "Bunting, sir." And as she spoke, the dark, heavy load of care again came down and settled on her sad, burdened heart. Perhaps she had been mistaken, after all. Or rather, she had not been mistaken in one sense, but perhaps this gentleman was a poor gentleman, too poor, that is, to afford the rent of more than one room, say 8 or 10 shillings a week. 8 or 10 shillings a week would be very little use to her in Bunting, though better than nothing at all. "Will you just look at the bedroom, sir?" "No," he said, "no. I think I should like to see what you have farther up the house, Mrs." And then, as if making a prodigious mental effort, he brought out her name. Bunting, with a kind of gasp. The 2 top rooms were, of course, immediately above the drawing-room floor, but they looked poor and mean, owing to the fact that they were bare of any kind of ornament. Very little trouble had been taken over their arrangement. In fact, they had been left in much the same condition as that in which the Buntings had found them. For the matter of that, it is difficult to make a nice, genteel sitting-room out of an apartment of which the principal features are a sink and a big gas stove. The gas stove, of an obsolete pattern, was fed by a tiresome, shilling-in-the-slot arrangement. It had been the property of the people from whom the Buntings had taken over the lease of the house, who, knowing it to be of no monetary value, had thrown it in among the humble fittings they had left behind. What furniture there was in the room was substantial and clean, as everything belonging to Mrs. Bunting was bound to be, but it was a bare, uncomfortable-looking place. and the landlady now felt sorry that she had done nothing to make it appear more attractive. To her surprise, however, her companion's dark, sensitive, hatchet-shaped face became irradiated with satisfaction. "Capital! Capital!" he exclaimed, for the first time putting down the bag he held at his feet, and rubbing his long, thin hands together with a quick, nervous movement. "This is just what I have been looking for." He walked with long, eager strides towards the gas stove. "First rate, quite first rate. Exactly what I wanted to find. You must understand, Bunting, that I am a man of science. I make, that is, all sorts of experiments, and I often require the presence of great heat." He shot out a hand, which she noticed shook a little, towards the stove. "This too will be useful, exceedingly useful to me," and he touched the edge of the stone sink with a lingering, caressing touch. He threw his head back and passed his hand over his high, bare forehead. Then, moving towards a chair, he sat down, wearily. "I'm tired," he muttered in a low voice. "Tired, tired. I've been walking about all day, Mrs. Bunting, and I could find nothing to sit down upon. They do not put benches for tired men in the London streets. They do so on the Continent. In some ways they are far more humane on the Continent than they are in England, Mrs. Bunting." "Indeed, sir," she said civilly, and then, after a nervous glance, she asked the question of which the answer would mean so much to her. "Then you mean to take my rooms, sir?" "This room, certainly," he said, looking round. "This room is exactly what I have been looking for, and longing for, the last few days." And then hastily he added, "I mean this kind of place is what I have always wanted to possess, Mrs. Bunting. You would be surprised if you knew how difficult it is to get anything of the sort. But now my weary search has ended, and that is a relief, a very, very great relief to me." He stood up and looked round him with a dreamy, abstracted air. And then, "Where's my bag?" he asked suddenly, and there came a note of sharp, angry fear in his voice. He glared at the quiet woman standing before him, and for a moment Mrs. Bunting felt a tremor of fright shoot through her. It seemed a pity that Bunting was so far away, right down the house. But Mrs. Bunting was aware that eccentricity has always been a perquisite, as it were, the special luxury, of the well-born and of the well-educated. Scholars, as she well knew, are never quite like other people, and her new lodger was undoubtedly a scholar. "Surely I had a bag when I came in," he said in a scared, troubled voice. "Here it is, sir," she said soothingly, and stooping, picked it up and handed it to him. And as she did so she noticed that the bag was not at all heavy. It was evidently by no means full. He took it eagerly from her. "I beg your pardon," he muttered, "but there is something in that bag which is very precious to me, something I procured with infinite difficulty, and which I could never get again without running into great danger, Mrs. Bunting. That must be the excuse for my late agitation." "About terms, sir," she said a little timidly, returning to the subject which meant so much, so very much to her. "About terms," he echoed. And then there came a pause. "My name is Sleuth," he said suddenly. "Sleuth. Think of a hound, Mrs. Bunting, and you'll never forget my name. I can provide you with a reference." He gave her what she described to herself as a funny sideways look. "But I should prefer you to dispense with that, if you don't mind. I am quite willing to pay you, well, shall we say a month in advance?" A spot of red shot into Mrs. Bunting's cheeks. She felt sick with relief, nay, with a joy which was almost pain. She had not known till that moment how hungry she was, how eager for a good meal. "That would be all right, sir," she murmured. "And what are you going to charge me?" There had come a kindly, almost a friendly note into his voice. "With attendance, mind. I shall expect you to give me attendance, and I need hardly ask if you can cook, Mrs. Bunting." "Oh, yes, sir," she said. "I am a plain cook. What would you say to 25 shillings a week, sir?" She looked at him deprecatingly, and as he did not answer she went on falteringly, "You see, sir, it may seem a good deal, but you would have the best of attendance and careful cooking, and my husband, sir, he would be pleased to valet you." "I shouldn't want anything of that sort done for me," said Mr. Sleuth hastily. "I prefer looking after my own clothes. I am used to waiting on myself. But, Mrs. Bunting, I have a great dislike to sharing lodgings." She interrupted eagerly, "I could let you have the use of the 2 floors for the same price. That is, until we get another lodger. "I shouldn't like you to sleep in the back room up here, sir. It's such a poor little room. You could do as you say, sir. Do your work and your experiments up here, and then have your meals in the drawing room." "Yes," he said hesitatingly, "that sounds a good plan. And if I offered you £2, or 2 guineas, might I then rely on your not taking another lodger?" "Yes," she said quietly. "I'd be very glad only to have you to wait on, sir." "I suppose you have a key to the door of this room, Mrs. Bunting? I don't like to be disturbed while I'm working." He waited a moment, and then said again, rather urgently, "I suppose you have a key to this door, Mrs. Bunting?" "Oh, yes, sir, there's a key, a very nice little key. The people who lived here before had a new kind of lock put on to the door." She went over, and throwing the door open, showed him that a round disc had been fitted above the old keyhole. He nodded his head, and then, after standing silent a little, as if absorbed in thought, "42 shillings a week. Yes, that will suit me perfectly, and I'll begin now by paying my first month's rent in advance. Now, 4 times 42 shillings is—" He jerked his head back and stared at his new landlady. For the first time he smiled, a queer, wry smile. "Why, just £8, 8 shillings, Mrs. Bunting." He thrust his hand through into an inner pocket of his long, cape-like coat and took out a handful of sovereigns. Then he began putting these down in a row on the bare wooden table which stood in the centre of the room. "Here's 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, £10. You'd better keep the odd change, Mrs. Bunting, for I shall want you to do some shopping for me tomorrow morning. I met with a misfortune today." But the new lodger did not speak as if his misfortune, whatever it was, weighed on his spirits. "Indeed, sir, I'm sorry to hear that." Mrs. Bunting's heart was going thump, thump, thump. She felt extraordinarily moved, dizzy with relief and joy. "Yes, a very great misfortune. I lost my luggage, the few things I managed to bring away with me." His voice dropped suddenly. "I shouldn't have said that," he muttered. "I was a fool to say that." Then more loudly, "Someone said to me, 'You can't go into a lodging-house without any luggage. They wouldn't take you in.' But you have taken me in, Mrs. Bunting, and I'm grateful for the kind way you have met me." He looked at her feelingly, appealingly, and Mrs. Bunting was touched. She was beginning to feel very kindly towards her new lodger. "I hope I know a gentleman when I see one," she said, with a break in her staid voice. "I shall have to see about getting some clothes tomorrow, Mrs. Bunting." Again he looked at her appealingly. "I expect you'd like to wash your hands now, sir. And would you tell me what you'd like for supper? We haven't much in the house." "Oh, anything'll do," he said hastily. "I don't want you to go out for me. It's a cold, foggy, wet night, Mrs. Bunting. If you have a little bread and butter and a cup of milk, I shall be quite satisfied." "I have a nice sausage," she said hesitatingly. It was a very nice sausage, and she had bought it that same morning for Bunting's supper. As to herself, she had been going to content herself with a little bread and cheese. But now, wonderful, almost intoxicating thought, she could send Bunting out to get anything they both liked. The 10 sovereigns lay in her hand full of comfort and good cheer. "A sausage? No, I fear that will hardly do. I never touch flesh meat," he said. "It is a long, long time since I tasted a sausage, Mrs. Bunting." "Is it indeed, sir?" She hesitated a moment, then asked stiffly, "And will you be requiring any beer or wine, sir?" A strange, wild look of lowering wrath suddenly filled Mr. Sleuth's pale face. "Certainly not. I thought I had made that quite clear, Mrs. Bunting. I had hoped to hear that you were an abstainer." "So I am, sir, lifelong. And so's Bunting been since we married." She might have said, had she been a woman given to make such confidences, that she had made Bunting abstain very quickly in their acquaintance. That he had given in about that had been the thing that first made her believe that he was sincere in all the nonsense that he talked to her in those far-away days of his courting. Glad she was now that he had taken the pledge as a younger man. But for that nothing would have kept him from the drink during the bad times they had gone through. And then, going downstairs, she showed Mr. Sleuth the nice bedroom which opened out of the drawing-room. It was a replica of Mrs. Bunting's own room just underneath, excepting that everything up here had cost just a little more, and was therefore rather better in quality. The new lodger looked round him with such a strange expression of content and peace stealing over his worn face. "A haven of rest," he muttered, and then, "He bringeth them to their desired haven." Beautiful words, Mrs. Bunting. "Yes, sir." Mrs. Bunting felt a little startled. It was the first time anyone had quoted the Bible to her for many a long day. But it seemed to set the seal, as it were, on Mr. Sleuth's respectability. What a comfort it was, too, that she had to deal with only one lodger, and that a gentleman, instead of with a married couple. Very peculiar married couples had drifted in and out of Mr. and Mrs. Bunting's lodgings, not only here in London, but at the seaside. How unlucky they had been, to be sure! Since they had come to London, not a single pair of lodgers had been even moderately respectable and kindly. The last lot had belonged to that horrible underworld of men and women who, having, as the phrase goes, seen better days, now only keep their heads above water with the help of petty fraud. "I'll bring you up some hot water in a minute, sir, and some clean towels," she said, going to the door. And then Mr. Sleuth turned quickly round. "Mrs. Bunting," and as he spoke he stammered a little, I don't want you to interpret the word attendance too liberally. You need not run yourself off your feet for me. I'm accustomed to look after myself." And queerly, uncomfortably, she felt herself dismissed, even a little snubbed. "All right, sir," she said. "I'll only just let you know when I've your supper ready." End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. But what was a little snub compared with the intense relief and joy of going down and telling Bunting of the great piece of good fortune which had fallen their way? Staid Mrs. Bunting seemed to make but one leap down the steep stairs. In the hall, however, she pulled herself together, and tried to still her agitation. She had always disliked and despised any show of emotion. She called such betrayal of feeling "making a fuss." Opening the door of their sitting-room, she stood for a moment looking at her husband's bent back, and she realized, with a pang of pain, how the last few weeks had aged him. Bunting suddenly looked round, and seeing his wife, stood up. He put the paper he had been holding down onto the table. "Well," he said. "Well, who was it, then?" He felt rather ashamed of himself. It was he who ought to have answered the door and done all that parleying of which he had heard murmurs. And then, in a moment, his wife's hand shot out, and the 10 sovereigns fell in a little clinking heap on the table. "Look there!" she whispered, with an excited, tearful quiver in her voice. "Look there, Bunting!" And Bunting did look there, but with a troubled, frowning gaze. He was not quick-witted, but at once he jumped to the conclusion that his wife had just had in a furniture dealer, and that this £10 represented all their nice furniture upstairs. If that were so, then it was the beginning of the end. That furniture in the first-floor front had cost, Ellen had reminded him of the fact bitterly only yesterday, £17 9 and every single item had been a bargain. It was too bad that she had only got £10 for it. Yet he hadn't the heart to reproach her. He did not speak as he looked across at her, and meeting that troubled, rebuking glance, she guessed what it was that he thought had happened. "We've a new lodger!" she cried. And Bunting? He's quite the gentleman. He actually offered to pay 4 weeks in advance at 2 guineas a week." "No, never." Bunting moved quickly round the table, and together they stood there, fascinated by the little heap of gold. "But there's 10 sovereigns here," he said suddenly. "Yes, the gentleman said I'd have to buy some things for him tomorrow. And oh, Bunting, he's so well spoken, I really felt that, and then Mrs. Bunting, taking a step or two sideways, sat down and throwing her little black apron over her face, burst into gasping sobs. Bunting patted her back timidly. "Ellen," he said, much moved by her agitation. "Ellen, don't take on so, my dear." "I won't," she sobbed. I won't. I'm a fool. I know I am. But oh, I didn't think we was ever going to have any luck again." And then she told him, or rather tried to tell him, what the lodger was like. Mrs. Bunting was no hand at talking, but one thing she did impress on her husband's mind, namely, that Mr. Sleuth was eccentric, as so many clever people are eccentric, that is, in a harmless way, and that he must be humoured. "He says he doesn't want to be waited on much," she said at last, wiping her eyes. "But I can see he will want a good bit of looking after, all the same, poor gentleman." And just as the words left her mouth there came the unfamiliar sound of a loud ring. It was that of the drawing-room bell being pulled again and again. Bunting looked at his wife eagerly. "I think I'd better go up, eh, Ellen?" he said. He felt quite anxious to see their new lodger. For the matter of that, it would be a relief to be doing something again. "Yes," she answered, "you go up. Don't keep him waiting. I wonder what it is he wants. I said I'd let him know when his supper was ready." A moment later Bunting came down again. There was an odd smile on his face. "Whatever do you think he wanted?" he whispered mysteriously, and as she said nothing, he went on. "He's asked me for the loan of a Bible." "Well, I don't see anything so out of the way in that," she said hastily, "'specially if he don't feel well. I'll take it up to him." And then going to a small table which stood between the two windows, Mrs. Bunting took off it a large Bible, which had been given to her as a wedding present by a married lady with whose mother she had lived for several years. "He said it would do quite well when you take up his supper," said Bunting. And then, "Ellen, he's a queer-looking cove, not like any gentleman I ever had to do with." "He is a gentleman," said Mrs. Bunting rather fiercely. "Oh, yes, that's all right." But still he looked at her doubtfully. "I asked him if he'd like me to just put away his clothes. But, Ellen, he said he hadn't got any clothes." "No more he hasn't." She spoke quickly, defensively. "He had the misfortune to lose his luggage. He's one dishonest folk 'ud take advantage of." "Yes, one can see that with half an eye," Bunting agreed. And then there was silence for a few moments while Mrs. Bunting put down on a little bit of paper the things she wanted her husband to go out and buy for her. She handed him the list, together with a sovereign. "Be as quick as you can," she said, "for I feel a bit hungry. I'll be going down now to see about Mr. Sleuth's supper. He only wants a glass of milk and 2 eggs. I'm glad I've never fallen to bad eggs." "Sleuth?" echoed Bunting, staring at her. "What a queer name. How do you spell it? Sluth?" "No," she shot out. "Sleuth." "Oh," he said doubtfully. He said, "Think of a hound, and you'll never forget my name," and Mrs. Bunting smiled. When he got to the door, Bunting turned round. "We'll now be able to pay young Chandler back some of that 30 shillings. I am glad." She nodded, her heart, as the saying is, too full for words. And then each went about his and her business, Bunting out into the drenching fog, his wife down to her cold kitchen. The lodger's tray was soon ready, everything upon it nicely and daintily arranged. Mrs. Bunting knew how to wait upon a gentleman. Just as the landlady was going up the kitchen stair, she suddenly remembered Mr. Sleuth's request for a Bible. Putting the tray down in the hall, she went into her sitting room and took up the book. But when back in the hall she hesitated a moment as to whether it was worth while to make 2 journeys. But no, she thought she could manage. Clasping the large, heavy volume under her arm, and taking up the tray, she walked slowly up the staircase. But a great surprise awaited her. In fact, when Mr. Sleuth's landlady opened the door of the drawing-room, she very nearly dropped the tray. She actually did drop the Bible, and it fell with a heavy thud to the ground. The new lodger had turned all those nice framed engravings of the early Victorian beauties, of which Mrs. Bunting had been so proud, with their faces to the wall. For a moment she was really too surprised to speak. Putting the tray down on the table, she stooped and picked up the book. It troubled her that the book should have fallen to the ground, but really she hadn't been able to help it. It was mercy that the tray hadn't fallen too. Mr. Sleuth got up. I have taken the liberty to arrange the room as I should wish it to be," he said awkwardly. "You see, Bunting, I felt as I sat here that these women's eyes followed me about. It was a most unpleasant sensation, and gave me quite an eerie feeling." The landlady was now laying a small tablecloth over half of the table. She made no answer to her lodger's remark, for the good reason that she did not know what to say. Her silence seemed to distress Mr. Sleuth. After what seemed a long pause, he spoke again. "I prefer bare walls, Mrs. Bunting," he spoke with some agitation. "As a matter of fact, I have been used to seeing bare walls about me for a long time." And then, at last his landlady answered him, in a composed, soothing voice, which somehow did him good to hear. "I quite understand, sir. And when Bunting comes in he shall take the pictures all down. We have plenty of space in our own rooms for them." Thank you very much." Mr. Sleuth appeared greatly relieved. "And I have brought you up my Bible, sir. I understand you wanted the loan of it?" Mr. Sleuth stared at her as if dazed for a moment, and then rousing himself he said, "Yes, yes, I do. There is no reading like the book. There is something there which suits every state of mind, aye, and of body too." "Very true, sir." And then Mrs. Bunting, having laid out what really looked a very appetizing little meal, turned round and quietly shut the door. She went down straight into her sitting room and waited there for Bunting instead of going to the kitchen to clear up. And as she did so there came to her a comfortable recollection, an incident of her long past youth, in the days when she, then Ellen Green, had mated a dear old lady. The old lady had a favourite nephew, a bright, jolly young gentleman who was learning to paint animals in Paris. And one morning Mr. Algernon—that was his rather peculiar Christian name—had had the impudence to turn to the wall 6 beautiful engravings of paintings done by the famous Mr. Landseer. Mrs. Bunting remembered all the circumstances as if they had only occurred yesterday, and yet she had not thought of them for years. It was quite early. She had come down, for in those days maids weren't thought so much of as they are now, and she slept with the upper housemaid, and it was the upper housemaid's duty to be down very early. And there, in the dining-room, she had found Mr. Algernon engaged in turning each engraving to the wall. Now his aunt thought all the world of those pictures, and Ellen had felt quite concerned, for it doesn't do for a young gentleman to put himself wrong with a kind aunt. "Oh, sir," she had exclaimed in dismay, "whatever are you doing?" And even now she could almost hear his merry voice, as he had answered, "I am doing my duty, fair Helen." He had always called her Fair Helen when no one was listening. "How can I draw ordinary animals when I see these half-human monsters staring at me all the time I am having my breakfast, my lunch, and my dinner?" That was what Mr. Algernon had said in his own saucy way, and that was what he repeated in a more serious, respectful manner to his aunt, when that dear old lady had come downstairs. In fact, he had declared, quite soberly, that the beautiful animals painted by Mr. Landseer put his eye out. But his aunt had been very much annoyed. In fact, she had made him turn the pictures all back again, and as long as he stayed there he just had to put up with what he called those half-human monsters. Mrs. Bunting, sitting there, thinking the matter of Mr. Sleuth's odd behaviour over, was glad to recall that funny incident of her long-gone youth. It seemed to prove that her new lodger was not so strange as he appeared to be. Still, when Bunting came in, she did not tell him the queer thing which had happened. She told herself that she would be quite able to manage the taking down of the pictures in the drawing-room herself. But before getting ready their own supper, Mr. Sleuth's landlady went upstairs to clear away, and when on the staircase she heard the sound of—was it talking in the drawing-room? Startled, she waited a moment on the landing outside the drawing-room door, then she realized that it was only the lodger reading aloud to himself. There was something very awful in the words which rose and fell on her listening ears. "A strange woman is a narrow gate. She also lieth in wait as for a prey, and increaseth the transgressors among men." She remained where she was, her hand on the handle of the door, and again there broke on her shrinking ears that curious, high, sing-song voice. "Her house is the way to hell, going down to the chambers of death." It made the listener feel quite queer, but at last she summoned up courage, knocked, and walked in. "I'd better clear away, sir, had I not?" she said. And Mr. Sleuth nodded. Then he got up and closed the book. "I think I'll go to bed now," he said. "I am very, very tired. I've had a long and a very weary day, Mrs. Bunting." After he had disappeared into the back room, Mrs. Bunting climbed up on a chair and unhooked the pictures which had so offended Mr. Sleuth. Each left an unsightly mark on the wall, but that, after all, could not be helped. Treading softly so that Bunting should not hear her, she carried them down, 2 by 2, and stood them behind her bed. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. Mrs. Bunting woke up the next morning feeling happier than she had felt for a very, very long time. For just one moment she could not think why she felt so different, and then she suddenly remembered. How comfortable it was to know that upstairs, just over her head, lay, in the well-found bed she had bought with such satisfaction at an auction held in a Baker Street house, a lodger who was paying 2 guineas a week. Something seemed to tell her that Mr. Sleuth would be a permanency. In any case, it wouldn't be her fault if he wasn't. As to his queerness, well, there's always something funny in everybody. But after she had got up, and as the morning wore itself away, Mrs. Bunting grew a little anxious, for there came no sound at all from the new lodger's rooms. At 12, however, the drawing-room bell rang. Mrs. Bunting hurried upstairs. She was painfully anxious to please and satisfy Mr. Sleuth. His coming had only been in the nick of time to save them from terrible disaster. She found her lodger up and fully dressed. He was sitting at the round table which occupied the middle of the sitting-room, and his landlady's large Bible lay open before him. As Mrs. Bunting came in, he looked up, and she was troubled to see how tired and worn he seemed. "You did not happen," he asked, "to have a concordance, Mrs. Bunting?" She shook her head. She had no idea what a concordance could be, but she was quite sure that she had nothing of the sort about. And then her new lodger proceeded to tell her what it was he desired her to buy for him. She had supposed the bag he had brought with him to contain certain little necessaries of civilized life, such articles, for instance, as a comb and brush, a set of razors, a toothbrush, to say nothing of a couple of nightshirts. But no, that was evidently not so, for Mr. Sleuth required all these things to be bought now. After having cooked him a nice breakfast, Mrs. Bunting hurried out to purchase the things of which he was in urgent need. How pleasant it was to feel that there was money in her purse again. Not only someone else's money, but money she was now in the very act of earning so agreeably. Mrs. Bunting first made her way to a little barber's shop close by. It was there she purchased the brush and comb and the razors. It was a funny, rather smelly little place, and she hurried as much as she could, the more so that the foreigner who served her insisted on telling her some of the strange, peculiar details of this Avenger murder which had taken place 48 hours before, and in which Bunting took such a morbid interest. The conversation upset Mrs. Bunting. She didn't want to think of anything painful or disagreeable on such a day as this. Then she came back and showed the lodger her various purchases. Mr. Sleuth was pleased with everything, and thanked her most courteously, but when she suggested doing his bedroom he frowned, and looked quite put out. "Please wait till this evening," he said hastily. "It is my custom to stay at home all day. I only care to walk about the streets when the lights are lit. You must bear with me, Mrs. Bunting, if I seem a little, just a little, unlike the lodgers you have been accustomed to. And I must ask you to understand that I must not be disturbed when thinking out my problems." He broke off short, sighed, then added solemnly, "For mine are the great problems of life and death." And Mrs. Bunting willingly fell in with his wishes. In spite of her prim manner and love of order, Mr. Sleuth's landlady was a true woman. She had, that is, an infinite patience with masculine vagaries and oddities. When she was downstairs again, Mr. Sleuth's landlady met with a surprise. But it was quite a pleasant surprise. While she had been upstairs, talking to the lodger, Bunting's young friend, Joe Chandler, the detective, had come in, and as she walked into the sitting-room she saw that her husband was pushing half a sovereign across the table towards Joe. Joe Chandler's fair, good-natured face was full of satisfaction. Not at seeing his money again, mark you, but at the news Bunting had evidently been telling him, that news of the sudden wonderful change in their fortunes, the coming of an ideal lodger. "Mr. Sleuth don't want me to do his bedroom till he's gone out," she exclaimed, and then she sat down for a bit of a rest. It was a comfort to know that the lodger was eating his good breakfast, and there was no need to think of him for the present. In a few minutes she would be going down to make her own and Bunting's dinner, and she told Joe Chandler that he might as well stop and have a bite with them. Her heart warmed to the young man, for Mrs. Bunting was in a mood which seldom surprised her, a mood to be pleased with anything and everything. Nay, more. When Bunting began to ask Joe Chandler about the last of those awful Avenger murders, she even listened with a certain languid interest to all he had to say. In the morning paper which Bunting had begun taking again that very day 3 columns were devoted to the extraordinary mystery which was now beginning to be the one topic of talk all over London, west and east, north and south. Bunting had read out little bits about it while they ate their breakfast, and in spite of herself Mrs. Bunting had felt thrilled and excited. "They do say," observed Bunting cautiously, "they do say, Joe, that the police have a clue they won't say nothing about?" He looked expectantly at his visitor. To Bunting, the fact that Chandler was attached to the detective section of the Metropolitan Police invested the young man with a kind of sinister glory, especially just now, when these awful and mysterious crimes were amazing and terrifying the town. "Them who says that says wrong," answered Chandler slowly, and a look of unease, of resentment came over his fair, stolid face. "'Twould make a good bit of difference to me if the Yard had a clue." And then Mrs. Bunting interposed. "Why that, Joe?" she said, smiling indulgently. The young man's keenness about his work pleased her. And in his slow, sure way Joe Chandler was very keen, and took his job very seriously. He put his whole heart and mind into it. "Well, 'tis this way," he explained. "From to-day I'm on this business myself. You see, Mrs. Bunting, the Yard's nettled. That's what it is, and we're all on our mettle. That we are. I was right down sorry for the poor chap who was on point duty in the street where the last one happened." "No!" said Bunting incredulously. "You don't mean there was a policeman there within a few yards?" That fact hadn't been recorded in his newspaper. Chandler nodded. "That's exactly what I do mean, Mr. Bunting. The man is near off his head, so I'm told. He did hear a yell, so he says, but he took no notice. There are a few good yells in that part of London, as you can guess. People always quarrelling and rowing at one another in such low parts." "Have you seen the bits of grey paper on which the monster writes his name?" inquired Bunting eagerly. Public imagination had been much stirred by the account of those three-cornered pieces of grey paper pinned to the victim's skirts, on which was roughly written in red ink and in printed characters the words, "The Avenger." His round, fat face was full of questioning eagerness. He put his elbows on the table and stared across expectantly at the young man. "Yes, I have," said Joe briefly. "A funny kind of visiting card, eh?" Bunting laughed. The notion struck him as downright comic. But Mrs. Bunting coloured. "It isn't a thing to make a joke about," she said reprovingly. And Chandler backed her up. "No, indeed," he said feelingly. "I'll never forget what I've been made to see over this job. And as for that grey bit of paper, Mr. Bunting, or rather those grey bits of paper," he corrected himself hastily, "you know they've 3 of them now at the Yard. Well, they gives me the horrors." And then he jumped up. "That reminds me that I oughtn't to be wasting my time in pleasant company." "Won't you stay and have a bit of dinner?" said Mrs. Bunting solicitously. But the detective shook his head. "No," he said, "I had a bite before I came out. Our job's a queer kind of job, as you know. A lot's left to our discretion, so to speak, but it don't leave us much time for lazing about, I can tell you." When he reached the door he turned round, and with elaborate carelessness he inquired, "Any chance of Miss Daisy coming to London again soon?" Bunting shook his head, but his face brightened. He was very, very fond of his only child. The pity was he saw her so seldom. "No," he said, "I'm afraid not, Joe. Old Aunt, as we calls the old lady, keeps Daisy pretty tightly tied to her apron string. She was quite put about that week the child was up with us last June." "Indeed? Well, so long." After his wife had let their friend out, Bunting said cheerfully, "Joe seems to like our Daisy, eh, Ellen?" But Mrs. Bunting shook her head scornfully. She did not exactly dislike the girl, though she did not hold with the way Bunting's daughter was being managed by that old aunt of hers, an idle, good-for-nothing way, very different from the fashion in which she herself had been trained at the Foundling, for Mrs. Bunting as a little child had known no other home, no other family than those provided by good Captain Coram. "Joe Chandler's too sensible a young chap to be thinking of girls yet awhile," she said tartly. "No doubt you're right," Bunting agreed. "Times be changed. In my young days chaps always had time for that. 'Twas just a notion that came into my head, hearing him asking, anxious-like, after her." About 5 o'clock, after the street lamps were well alight, Mr. Sleuth went out, and that same evening there came 2 parcels addressed to his landlady. These parcels contained clothes. But it was quite clear to Mrs. Bunting's eyes that they were not new clothes. In fact, they had evidently been bought in some good second-hand clothes shop. A funny thing for a real gentleman like Mr. Sleuth to do. It proved that he had given up all hope of getting back his lost luggage. When the lodger had gone out he had not taken his bag with him, of that Mrs. Bunting was positive. And yet, though she searched high and low for it, she could not find the place where Mr. Sleuth kept it. And at last, had it not been that she was a very clear-headed woman, with a good memory, she would have been disposed to think that the bag had never existed, save in her imagination. But no, she could not tell herself that. She remembered exactly how it had looked when Mr. Sleuth had first stood, a strange, queer-looking figure of a man, on her doorstep. She further remembered how he had put the bag down on the floor of the top front room, and then, forgetting what he had done, how he had asked her eagerly, in a tone of angry fear, where the bag was, only to find it safely lodged at his feet. As time went on, Mrs. Bunting thought a great deal about that bag. For, strange and amazing fact, she never saw Mr. Sleuth's bag again. But of course she soon formed a theory as to its whereabouts. The brown leather bag which had formed Mr. Sleuth's only luggage the afternoon of his arrival was almost certainly locked up in the lower part of the drawing-room chiffonier. Mr. Sleuth evidently always carried the key of the little corner cupboard about his person. Mrs. Bunting had also had a good hunt for that key, but, as was the case with the bag, the key disappeared, and she never saw either the one or the other again. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. How quietly, how uneventfully, how pleasantly sped the next few days! Already life was settling down into a groove. Waiting on Mr. Sleuth was just what Mrs. Bunting could manage to do easily, and without tiring herself. It had at once become clear that the lodger preferred to be waited on only by one person, and that person his landlady. He gave her very little trouble. Indeed, it did her good having to wait on the lodger. It even did her good that he was not like other gentlemen, for the fact occupied her mind, and in a way it amused her. The more so that whatever his oddities, Mr. Sleuth had none of those tiresome, disagreeable ways with which landladies are only too familiar, and which seem peculiar only to those human beings who also happen to be lodgers. To take but one point, Mr. Sleuth did not ask to be called unduly early. Bunting and his Ellen had fallen into the way of lying rather late in the morning, and it was a great comfort not to have to turn out to make the lodger a cup of tea at 7 or even half-past 7. Mr. Sleuth seldom required anything before 11. But odd he certainly was. The second evening he had been with them, Mr. Sleuth had brought in a book of which the queer name was Cruden's Concordance. That and the Bible, Mrs. Bunting had soon discovered that there was a relation between the two books, seemed to be the lodger's only reading. He spent hours each day, generally after he had eaten the breakfast which also served for luncheon, poring over the Old Testament and over that strange kind of index to the book. As for the delicate and yet the all-important question of money, Mr. Sleuth was everything that the most exacting landlady could have wished. Never had there been a more confiding or trusting gentleman. On the very first day he had been with them he had allowed his money, the considerable sum of 184 sovereigns, to lie about wrapped up in little pieces of rather dirty newspaper on his dressing-table. That had quite upset Mrs. Bunting. She had allowed herself respectfully to point out to him that what he was doing was foolish, indeed wrong. But as only answer he had laughed, and she had been startled when the loud, unusual, and discordant sound had issued from his thin lips. "I know those I can trust," he had answered, stuttering, rather as was his way when moved. And I assure you, Mrs. Bunting, that I hardly have to speak to a human being, especially to a woman," and he had drawn in his breath with a hissing sound, "before I know exactly what manner of person is before me." It hadn't taken the landlady very long to find out that her lodger had a queer kind of fear and dislike of women. When she was doing the staircase and landings she would often hear Mr. Sleuth reading aloud to himself passages in the Bible that were very uncomplimentary to her sex. But Mrs. Bunting had no very great opinion of her sister woman, so that didn't put her out. Besides, where one's lodger is concerned, a dislike of women is better than the other thing. In any case, where would have been the good of worrying about the lodger's funny ways? Of course, Mr. Sleuth was eccentric. If he hadn't been, as Bunting funnily styled it, "just a leetle touched upstairs," he wouldn't be here, living this strange, solitary life in lodgings. He would be living in quite a different sort of way with some of his relatives, or with a friend of his own class. There came a time when Mrs. Bunting, looking back, as even the least imaginative of us are apt to look back to any part of our own past lives which becomes for any reason poignantly memorable, wondered how soon it was that she had discovered that her lodger was given to creeping out of the house at a time when almost all living things prefer to sleep. She brought herself to believe, but I am inclined to doubt whether she was right in so believing, that the first time she became aware of this strange nocturnal habit of Mr. Sleuth's happened to be during the night which preceded the day on which she had observed a very curious circumstance. This very curious circumstance was the complete disappearance of one of Mr. Sleuth's 3 suits of clothes. It always passes my comprehension how people can remember, over any length of time, not every moment of certain happenings, for that is natural enough, but the day, the hour, the minute when these happenings took place. Much as she thought about it afterwards, even Mrs. Bunting never quite made up her mind whether it was during the 5th or the 6th night of Mr. Sleuth's stay under her roof that she became aware that he had gone out at 2 in the morning and had only come in at 5. But that there did come such a night is certain as is the fact that her discovery coincided with various occurrences which were destined to remain retrospectively memorable. It was intensely dark, intensely quiet, the darkest, quietest hour of the night, when suddenly Mrs. Bunting was awakened from a deep, dreamless sleep by sounds at once unexpected and familiar. She knew at once what those sounds were. They were those made by Mr. Sleuth, first coming down the stairs and walking on tiptoe, she was sure it was on tiptoe, past her door, and finally softly shutting the front door behind him. Try as she would, Mrs. Bunting found it quite impossible to go to sleep again. There she lay, wide awake, afraid to move lest Bunting should waken up too, till she heard Mr. Sleuth, 3 hours later, creep back into the house, and so up to bed. Then, and not till then, she slept again. But in the morning she felt very tired, so tired indeed that she had been very glad when Bunting good-naturedly suggested that he should go out and do their little bit of marketing. The worthy couple had very soon discovered that in the matter of catering it was not altogether an easy matter to satisfy Mr. Sleuth, and that though he always tried to appear pleased, this perfect lodger had one serious fault from the point of view of those who keep lodgings. Strange to say, he was a vegetarian. He would not eat meat in any form. He sometimes, however, condescended to a chicken, and when he did so condescend, he generously intimated that Mr. and Mrs. Bunting were welcome to a share in it. Now today, this day of which the happenings were to linger in Mrs. Bunting's mind so very long, and to remain so very vivid, it had been arranged that Mr. Sleuth was to have some fish for his lunch, while what he left was to be "done up" to serve for his simple supper. Knowing that Bunting would be out for at least an hour, for he was a gregarious soul, and liked to have a gossip in the shops he frequented, Mrs. Bunting rose and dressed in a leisurely manner. Then she went, and did, her front sitting-room. She felt languid and dull, as one is apt to feel after a broken night, and it was a comfort to her to know that Mr. Sleuth was not likely to ring before 12. But long before 12 a loud ring suddenly clanged through the quiet house. She knew it for the front door-bell. Mrs. Bunting frowned. No doubt the ring betokened one of those tiresome people who come round for old bottles and such like fal-lals. She went slowly, reluctantly to the door, and then her face cleared, for it was that good young chap, Joe Chandler, who stood waiting outside. He was breathing a little hard, as if he had walked over quickly through the moist, foggy air. "Why, Joe," said Mrs. Bunting wonderingly, "come in, do. Bunting's out, but he won't be very long now. You've been quite a stranger these last few days." "Well, you know why, Mrs. Bunting." She stared at him for a moment, wondering what he could mean. Then suddenly she remembered. Why, of course, Joe was on a big job just now, the job of trying to catch the Avenger. Her husband had alluded to the fact again and again when reading out to her little bits from the halfpenny evening paper he was taking again. She led the way to the sitting-room. It was a good thing Bunting had insisted on lighting the fire before he went out, for now the room was nice and warm, and it was just horrible outside. She had felt a chill go right through her as she had stood, even for that second, at the front door. and she hadn't been alone to feel it, for, "I say, it is jolly to be in here out of that awful cold," exclaimed Chandler, sitting down heavily in Bunting's easy-chair. And then Mrs. Bunting bethought herself that the young man was tired as well as cold. He was pale, almost pallid under his usual healthy tanned complexion, the complexion of the man who lives much out of doors. "Wouldn't you like me just to make you a cup of tea?" she said solicitously. "Well, to tell truth, I should be right down thankful for one, Mrs. Bunting." Then he looked round, and again he said her name. "Mrs. Bunting." He spoke in so odd, so thick a tone that she turned quickly. "Yes, what is it, Joe?" she asked. And then, in sudden terror, "You've never come to tell me that anything's happened to Bunting? He's not had an accident?" "Goodness, no! Whatever made you think that?" But Mrs. Bunting, there's been another of them." His voice dropped almost to a whisper. He was staring at her with unhappy, it seemed to her, terror-filled eyes. "Another of them?" She looked at him bewildered, at a loss. And then what he meant flashed across her. Another of them meant another of these strange, mysterious, awful murders. But her relief for the moment was so great, for she really had thought for a second that he had come to give her ill news of Bunting, that the feeling that she did experience on hearing this piece of news was actually pleasurable, though she would have been much shocked had that fact been brought to her notice. Almost in spite of herself, Mrs. Bunting had become keenly interested in the amazing series of crimes which was occupying the imagination of the whole of London's netherworld. Even her refined mind had busied itself for the last 2 or 3 days with the strange problem so frequently presented to it by Bunting, for Bunting, now that they were no longer worried, took an open, unashamed, intense interest in the Avenger and his doings. She took the kettle off the gas ring. "It's a pity Bunting isn't here," she said, drawing in her breath. "He'd 'a' liked so much to hear you tell all about it, Joe." As she spoke she was pouring boiling water into a little teapot. But Chandler said nothing, and she turned and glanced at him. "Why, you do look bad!" she exclaimed. And indeed the young fellow did look bad, very bad indeed. "I can't help it," he said, with a kind of gasp. "It was your saying that about my telling you all about it that made me turn queer. You see, this time I was one of the first there, and it fairly turned me sick, that it did. Oh, it was too awful, Mrs. Bunting. Don't talk of it." He began gulping down the hot tea before it was well made. She looked at him with sympathetic interest. "Why, Joe," she said, "I never would have thought, with all the horrible sights you see, that anything could upset you like that." "This isn't like anything there's ever been before," he said. And then, "Oh, Mrs. Bunting, 'twas I that discovered the piece of paper this time." "Then it is true!" she cried eagerly. "It is the Avenger's bit of paper! Bunting always said it was. He never believed in that practical joker." "I did," said Chandler reluctantly. "You see, there are some queer fellows, even," he lowered his voice and looked round him as if the walls had ears, "even in the force, Mrs. Bunting, and these murders have fair got on our nerves." "No, never!" she said. "Do you think that a bobby might do a thing like that?" He nodded impatiently, as if the question wasn't worth answering. Then, "It was all along of that bit of paper and my finding it while the poor soul was still warm," he shuddered, "that brought me out west this morning. One of our bosses lives close by, in Prince Albert Terrace, and I had to go and tell him all about it. They never offered me a bit or a sup. I think they might have done that, don't you, Mrs. Bunting?" "Yes," she said absently. "Yes, I do think so. But there, I don't know that I ought to say that," went on Chandler. "He had me up in his dressing-room, and was very considerate-like to me while I was telling him." "Have a bit of something now?" she said suddenly. "Oh, no, I couldn't eat anything," he said hastily. "I don't feel as if I could ever eat anything any more." "That'll only make you ill." Mrs. Bunting spoke rather crossly, for she was a sensible woman. And to please her he took a bite out of the slice of bread and butter she had cut for him. "I expect you're right," he said, "and I've a goodish heavy day in front of me. Been up since 4, too." "4?" she said. "Was it then they found—" She hesitated a moment and then said, "It?" He nodded. "It was just a chance I was near by. If I'd been half a minute sooner, either I or the officer who found her must have knocked up against that that monster, but 2 or 3 people do think they saw him slinking away." "What was he like?" she asked curiously. "Well, that's hard to answer. You see, there was such an awful fog. But there's one thing they all agree about. He was carrying a bag." "A bag?" repeated Mrs. Bunting in a low voice. "Whatever sort of bag might it have been, Joe?" There had come across her, just right in her middle like, such a strange sensation, a curious kind of tremor or fluttering. She was at a loss to account for it. "Just a handbag," said Joe Chandler vaguely. "A woman I spoke to, cross-examining her like, who was positive she had seen him, said, 'Just a tall, thin shadow, that's what he was, a tall, thin shadow of a man, with a bag.'" "With a bag," repeated Mrs. Bunting absently. "How very strange and peculiar." "Why, no, not strange at all. He has to carry the thing he does the deed with in something, Mrs. Bunting. We've always wondered how he hid it. They generally throws the knife or firearms away, you know." "Do they indeed?" Mrs. Bunting still spoke in that absent, wondering way. She was thinking that she really must try and see what the lodger had done with his bag. It was possible, in fact, when one came to think of it, it was very probable, that he had just lost it, being so forgetful a gentleman, on one of the days he had gone out, as she knew he was fond of doing, into the Regent's Park. "There'll be a description circulated in an hour or 2, went on Chandler. "Perhaps that'll help catch him. There isn't a London man or woman, I don't suppose, who wouldn't give a good bit to lay that chap by the heels. Well, I suppose I must be going now." "Won't you wait a bit longer for Bunting?" she said hesitatingly. "No, I can't do that. But I'll come in, maybe, either this evening or tomorrow, and tell you any more that's happened. Thanks kindly for the tea. It's made a man of me, Mrs. Bunting." "Well, you've had enough to unman you, Joe." "Aye, that I have," he said heavily. A few minutes later Bunting did come in, and he and his wife had quite a little tiff, the first tiff they had had since Mr. Sleuth became their lodger. It fell out this way. When he heard who had been there, Bunting was angry that Mrs. Bunting hadn't got more details of the horrible occurrence which had taken place that morning out of Chandler. "You don't mean to say, Ellen, that you can't even tell me where it happened?" he said indignantly. "I suppose you put Chandler off, that's what you did. Why, whatever did he come here for, excepting to tell us all about it?" "He came to have something to eat and drink," snapped out Mrs. Bunting. "That's what the poor lad came for, if you want to know. He could hardly speak of it at all, he felt so bad. In fact, he didn't say a word about it until he'd come right into the room and sat down. He told me quite enough." "Didn't he tell you if the piece of paper on which the murderer had written his name was square or three-cornered?" demanded Bunting. "No, he did not. And that isn't the sort of thing I should have cared to ask him." "The more fool you—" And then he stopped abruptly. The newsboys were coming down the Marylebone Road, shouting out the awful discovery which had been made that morning, that of the Avenger's 5th murder. Bunting went out to buy a paper, and his wife took the things he had brought in down to the kitchen. The noise the newspaper sellers made outside had evidently wakened Mr. Sleuth, for his landlady hadn't been in the kitchen 10 minutes before his bell rang. Chapter 6. Mr. Sleuth's bell rang again. Mr. Sleuth's breakfast was quite ready, but for the first time since he had been her lodger, Mrs. Bunting did not answer the summons at once. But when there came the second imperative tinkle, for electric bells had not been fitted into that old-fashioned house, she made up her mind to go upstairs. As she emerged into the hall from the kitchen stairway, Bunting, sitting comfortably in their parlour, heard his wife stepping heavily under the load of the well-laden tray. "Wait a minute," he called out. "I'll help you, Ellen," and he came out and took the tray from her. She said nothing, and together they proceeded up to the drawing-room floor landing. There she stopped him. "Here," she whispered quickly, "you give me that, Bunting. The lodger won't like your going in to him." And then, as he obeyed her, and was about to turn downstairs again, she added in a rather acid tone, "You might open the door for me, at any rate. How can I manage to do it with this here heavy tray on my hands?" She spoke in a queer, jerky way, and Bunting felt surprised, rather put out. Ellen wasn't exactly what you'd call a lively, jolly woman, but when things were going well, as now, she was generally equable enough. He supposed she was still resentful of the way he had spoken to her about young Chandler in the New Avenger murder. However, he was always for peace, so he opened the drawing-room door, and as soon as he had started going downstairs, Mrs. Bunting walked into the room. And then at once there came over her the queerest feeling of relief, of lightness of heart. As usual, the lodger was sitting at his old place, reading the Bible. Somehow, she could not have told you why, she would not willingly have told herself, she had expected to see Mr. Sleuth looking different. But no, he appeared to be exactly the same. In fact, as he glanced up at her, a pleasanter smile than usual lighted up his thin, pallid face. "Well, Mrs. Bunting," he said genially, "I overslept myself this morning, but I feel all the better for the rest." "I'm glad of that, sir," she answered in a low voice. "One of the ladies I once lived with used to say, 'Rest is an old-fashioned remedy, but it's the best remedy of all.'" Mr. Sleuth himself removed the Bible and Cruden's Concordance off the table out of her way, and then he stood watching his landlady laying the cloth. Suddenly he spoke again. He was not often so talkative in the morning. "I think, Mrs. Bunting, that there was someone with you outside the door just now?" "Yes, sir. Bunting helped me up with the tray." "I'm afraid I give you a good deal of trouble," he said hesitatingly. But she answered quickly, "Oh, no, sir. Not at all, sir. I was only saying yesterday that we've never had a lodger that gave us as little trouble as you do, sir." "I'm glad of that. I am aware that my habits are somewhat peculiar." He looked at her fixedly, as if expecting her to give some sort of denial to this observation. But Mrs. Bunting was an honest and truthful woman. It never occurred to her to question his statement. Mr. Sleuth's habits were somewhat peculiar. Take that going out at night, or rather in the early morning, for instance. So she remained silent. After she had laid the lodger's breakfast on the table, she prepared to leave the room. "I suppose I'm not to do your room till you goes out, sir?" And Mr. Sleuth looked up sharply. "No, no," he said. "I never want my room done when I am engaged in studying the Scriptures, Mrs. Bunting. But I am not going out today. I shall be carrying out a somewhat elaborate experiment, upstairs. If I go out at all—" he waited a moment, and again he looked at her fixedly. "I shall wait till night time to do so." And then, coming back to the matter in hand, he added hastily, "Perhaps you could do my room when I go upstairs, about 5 o'clock, if that time is convenient to you, that is." "Oh, yes, sir, that'll do nicely." Mrs. Bunting went downstairs, and as she did so she took herself wordlessly, ruthlessly to task, but she did not face, even in her inmost heart, the strange tenors and tremors which had so shaken her. She only repeated to herself again and again, "I've got upset, that's what I've done." And then she spoke aloud, "I must get myself a dose at the chemist's next time I'm out. That's what I must do." And just as she murmured the word "do," there came a loud double knock on the front door. It was only the postman's knock, but the postman was an unfamiliar visitor in that house, and Mrs. Bunting started violently. She was nervous. That's what was the matter with her, so she told herself angrily. No doubt this was a letter for Mr. Sleuth. The lodger must have relations and acquaintances somewhere in the world. All gentlefolk have. But when she picked the small envelope off the hall floor, she saw it was a letter from Daisy, her husband's daughter. "Bunting," she called out sharply, "here's a letter for you." She opened the door of their sitting-room and looked in. Yes, there was her husband, sitting back comfortably in his easy-chair, reading a paper. And as she saw his broad, rather rounded back, Mrs. Bunting felt a sudden thrill of sharp irritation. There he was, doing nothing. In fact, doing worse than nothing, wasting his time reading all about those horrid crimes. She sighed, a long, unconscious sigh. Bunting was getting into idle ways, bad ways for a man of his years, but how could she prevent it? He had been such an active, conscientious sort of man when they had first made acquaintance. She also could remember, even more clearly than Bunting did himself, that first meeting of theirs in the dining-room of No. 90 Cumberland Terrace. As she had stood there, pouring out her mistress's glass of port wine, she had not been too much absorbed in her task to have a good, out-of-her-eye look at the spruce, nice, respectable-looking fellow who was standing over by the window. How superior he had appeared even then to the man she already hoped he would succeed as butler. Today, perhaps because she was not feeling quite herself, the past rose before her very vividly, and a lump came into her throat. Putting the letter addressed to her husband on the table, she closed the door softly and went down into the kitchen. There were various little things to put away and clean up, as well as their dinner to cook. And all the time she was down there she fixed her mind obstinately, determinedly on Bunting and on the problem of Bunting. She wondered what she'd better do to get him into good ways again. Thanks to Mr. Sleuth, their outlook was now moderately bright. A week ago everything had seemed utterly hopeless. It seemed as if nothing could save them from disaster. But everything was now changed. Perhaps it would be well for her to go and see the new proprietor of that registry office in Baker Street, which had lately changed hands. It would be a good thing for Bunting to get even an occasional job. For the matter of that, he could now take up a fairly regular thing in the way of waiting. Mrs. Bunting knew that it isn't easy to get a man out of idle ways once he has acquired those ways. When at last she went upstairs again she felt a little ashamed of what she had been thinking, for Bunting had laid the cloth, and laid it very nicely too, and brought up the 2 chairs to the table. "Ellen," he cried eagerly, "here's news. Daisy's coming tomorrow. There's scarlet fever in their house. Old Aunt thinks she'd better come away for a few days. So you see she'll be here for her birthday. 18, that's what she'll be on the 19th. It do make me feel old, that it do." Mrs. Bunting put down the tray. "I can't have the girl here just now," she said shortly. "I've just as much to do as I can manage. The lodger gives me more trouble than you seem to think for." "Rubbish," he said sharply. "I'll help you with the lodger. It's your own fault you haven't had help with him before. Of course Daisy must come here. Whatever other place could the girl go to?" Bunting felt pugnacious, so cheerful as to be almost light-hearted. But as he looked across at his wife his feeling of satisfaction vanished. Ellen's face was pinched and drawn today. She looked ill and horribly tired. It was very aggravating of her to go and behave like this, just when they were beginning to get on nicely again. "For the matter of that," he said suddenly, "Daisy'll be able to help you with the work, Ellen, and she'll brisk us both up a bit." Mrs. Bunting made no answer. She sat down heavily at the table. And then she said languidly, "You might as well show me the girl's letter." He handed it across to her, and she read it slowly to herself. "Dear Father," it ran, "I hope this finds you as well as it leaves me. Mrs. Puddle's youngest has got scarlet fever, and Aunt thinks I'd better come away at once, just to stay with you for a few days. Please tell Ellen I won't give her no trouble. I'll start at 10 if I don't hear nothing. Your loving daughter." "Yes, I suppose Daisy will have to come here," Mrs. Bunting said slowly. "It'll do her good to have a bit of work to do for once in her life." And with that ungraciously worded permission, Bunting had to content himself. Quietly the rest of that eventful day sped by. When dusk fell, Mr. Sleuth's landlady heard him go upstairs to the top floor. She remembered that this was the signal for her to go and do his room. He was a tidy man, was the lodger. He did not throw his things about as so many gentlemen do, leaving them all over the place. No, he kept everything scrupulously tidy. His clothes and the various articles Mrs. Bunting had bought for him during the first 2 days he had been there were carefully arranged in the chest of drawers. He had lately purchased a pair of boots. Those he had arrived in were peculiar-looking footgear, buff leather shoes with rubber soles, and he had told his landlady on that very first day that he never wished them to go down to be cleaned. A funny idea, a funny habit that, of going out for a walk after midnight in weather so cold and foggy that all other folk were glad to be at home snug in bed. But then Mr. Sleuth himself admitted that he was a funny sort of gentleman. After she had done his bedroom, the landlady went into the sitting-room and gave it a good dusting. This room was not kept quite as nice as she would have liked it to be. Mrs. Bunting longed to give the drawing-room something of a good turnout, but Mr. Sleuth disliked her to be moving about in it when he himself was in his bedroom, and when up he sat there almost all the time. Delighted as he had seemed to be with the top room, he only used it when making his mysterious experiments, and never during the daytime. And now, this afternoon, she looked at the rosewood chiffonier with longing eyes. She even gave that pretty little piece of furniture a slight shake. If only the doors would fly open, as the locked doors of old cupboards sometimes do, even after they have been securely fastened, how pleased she would be, how much more comfortable somehow she would feel. But the chiffonier refused to give up its secret. About 8 o'clock on that same evening Joe Chandler came in, just for a few minutes' chat. He had recovered from his agitation of the morning, but he was full of eager excitement, and Mrs. Bunting listened in silence, intensely interested in spite of herself, while he and Bunting talked. "Yes," he said, "I'm as right as a trivet now. I've had a good rest, laid down all this afternoon. You see, the Yard thinks there's going to be something on tonight. He's always done them in pairs." "So he has," exclaimed Bunting wonderingly. "So he has. Now I never thought of that. Then you think, Joe, that the monster'll be on the job again tonight?" Chandler nodded. "Yes, and I think there's a very good chance of his being caught, too." "I suppose there'll be a lot on the watch tonight, eh?" "I should think there will be. How many of our men do you think there'll be on night duty tonight, Mr. Bunting?" Bunting shook his head. "I don't know," he said helplessly. "I mean extra," suggested Chandler in an encouraging voice. 1,000, ventured Bunting. 5,000, Mr. Bunting. "Never!" exclaimed Bunting, amazed. And even Mrs. Bunting echoed, "Never!" incredulously. "Yes, that there will. You see, the boss has got his monkey up." Chandler drew a folded-up newspaper out of his coat pocket. "Just listen to this. The police have reluctantly to admit that they have no clue to the perpetrators of these horrible crimes, and we cannot feel any surprise at the information that a popular attack has been organized on the Chief Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. There is even talk of an indignation mass meeting." What do you think of that? That's not a pleasant thing for a gentleman as is doing his best to read, eh? "Well, it does seem queer that the police can't catch him, now doesn't it?" said Bunting, argumentatively. "I don't think it's queer at all," said young Chandler crossly. "Now you just listen again. Here's a bit of the truth for once, in a newspaper." And slowly he read out: "The detection of crime in London now resembles a game of blind man's buff, in which the detective has his hands tied and his eyes bandaged. Thus is he turned loose to hunt the murderer through the slums of a great city." "Whatever does that mean?" said Bunting. "Your hands aren't tied and your eyes aren't bandaged, Joe." "It's metaphorical like that it's intended, Mr. Bunting. We haven't got the same facilities. No, not a quarter of them, that the French techs have." And then, for the first time, Mrs. Bunting spoke. "What was that word, Joe? Perpetrators. I mean that first bit you read out." "Yes," he said, turning to her eagerly. "Then do they think there's more than one of them?" she said, and a look of relief came over her thin face. "There's some of our chaps thinks it's a gang," said Chandler. "They say it can't be the work of one man." "What do you think, Joe?" "Well, Mrs. Bunting, I don't know what to think. I'm fair puzzled." He got up. "Don't you come to the door. I'll shut it all right. So long. See you tomorrow, perhaps." As he had done the other evening, Mr. and Mrs. Bunting's visitor stopped at the door. "Any news of Miss Daisy?" he asked casually. "Yes, she's coming tomorrow," said her father. "They've got scarlet fever at her place, so old Aunt thinks she'd better clear out." The husband and wife went to bed early that night, but Mrs. Bunting found she could not sleep. She lay wide awake, hearing the hours, the half-hours, the quarters chime out from the belfry of the old church close by. And then, just as she was dozing off, it must have been about 1 o'clock, she heard the sound she had half unconsciously been expecting to hear, that of the lodger's stealthy footsteps coming down the stairs just outside her room. He crept along the passage and let himself out very, very quietly. But though she tried to keep awake, Mrs. Bunting did not hear him come in again, for she soon fell into a heavy sleep. Oddly enough, she was the first to wake the next morning. Odder still, it was she, not Bunting, who jumped out of bed, and going out into the passage, picked up the newspaper which had just been pushed through the letter-box. But having picked it up, Mrs. Bunting did not go back at once into her bedroom. Instead, she lit the gas in the passage, and leaning up against the wall to steady herself, for she was trembling with cold and fatigue, she opened the paper. Yes, there was the heading she sought. The Avenger Murders. But oh, how glad she was to see the words that followed. Up to the time of going to press, there is little new to report concerning the extraordinary series of crimes which are amazing and indeed staggering not only London, but the whole civilized world, and which would seem to be the work of some woman-hating teetotal fanatic. Since yesterday morning, when the last of these dastardly murders was committed, no reliable clue to the perpetrator or perpetrators has been obtained, though several arrests were made in the course of the day. In every case, however, those arrested were able to prove a satisfactory alibi." And then, a little lower down, "The excitement grows and grows. It is not too much to say that even a stranger to London would know that something very unusual was in the air. As for the place where the murder was committed last night—" "Last night!" thought Mrs. Bunting, startled, and then she realized that "last night" in this connection meant the night before last. She began the sentence again. "As for the place where the murder was committed last night, all approaches to it were still blocked up to a late hour by hundreds of onlookers, though of course nothing now remains in the way of traces of the tragedy." Slowly and carefully Mrs. Bunting folded the paper up again in its original creases, and then she stooped and put it back down on the mat where she had found it. She then turned out the gas, and going back into bed she lay down by her still sleeping husband. "Anything the matter?" Bunting murmured, and stirred uneasily. "Anything the matter, Ellen?" She answered in a whisper thrilling with a strange gladness. "No, nothing, Bunting, nothing the matter. Go to sleep again, my dear." They got up an hour later, both in a happy, cheerful mood. Bunting rejoiced at the thought of his daughter's coming, and even Daisy's stepmother told herself that it would be pleasant having the girl about the house to help her a bit. About 10 o'clock Bunting went out to do some shopping. He brought back with him a nice little bit of pork for Daisy's dinner, and 3 mince pies. He even remembered to get some apples for the sauce. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. Just as 12 was striking, a four-wheeler drew up to the gate. It brought Daisy, pink-cheeked, excited, laughing-eyed Daisy, a sight to gladden any father's heart. "Old Aunt said I was to have a cab if the weather was bad," she cried out joyously. There was a bit of a wrangle over the fare. King's Cross, as all the world knows, is nothing like 2 miles from the Marylebone Road, but the man clamoured for 1 and 6 pence, and hinted darkly that he had done the young lady a favour in bringing her at all. While he and Bunting were having words, Daisy, leaving them to it, walked up the flagged path to the door where her stepmother was awaiting her. As they were exchanging a rather frigid kiss—indeed, 'twas a mere peck on Mrs. Bunting's part—there fell, with startling suddenness, loud cries on the still, cold air. Long drawn and wailing, they sounded strangely sad as they rose and fell across the distant roar of traffic in the Edgware Road. "What's that?" exclaimed Bunting wonderingly. "Why, whatever's that?" The cabman lowered his voice. "Them's a-crying out that 'orrible affair at King's Cross. He's done for 2 of 'em this time. That's what I meant when I said I might 'a got a better fare. I wouldn't say nothink before little missy there, but folk have been coming from all over London the last 5 or 6 hours, plenty of toffs, too. But there's nothing to see now." "What? Another woman murdered last night?" Bunting felt tremendously thrilled. What had the 5,000 constables been about, to let such a dreadful thing happen? The cabman stared at him surprised. "2 of 'em, I tell yer, within a few yards of one another. He have got a nerve, but, of course, they was drunk. He got a down on the drink." "Have they caught him?" asked Bunting perfunctorily. "Lord, no, they'll never catch him. It must have happened hours and hours ago. They was both stone cold. One each end of a little passage what ain't used no more. That's why they didn't find him before." The hoarse cries were coming nearer and nearer, 2 news vendors trying to outshout each other. "'Orrible discovery near King's Cross!" they yelled exultingly. "The Avenger again!" And Bunting, with his daughter's large straw hold-all in his hand, ran forward into the roadway and recklessly gave a boy a penny for a halfpenny paper. He felt very much moved and excited. Somehow his acquaintance with young Joe Chandler made these murders seem a personal affair. He hoped that Chandler would come in soon and tell them all about it, as he had done yesterday morning when he, Bunting, had unluckily been out. As he walked back into the little hall he heard Daisy's voice, high, voluble, excited, giving her stepmother a long account of the scarlet fever case, and how at first Old Aunt's neighbours had thought it was not scarlet fever at all, but just nettle rash. But as Bunting pushed open the door of the sitting-room, there came a cry of sharp alarm in his daughter's voice, and he heard her cry, "Why, Ellen, whatever is the matter? You do look bad." And his wife's muffled answer, "Open the window, do." "'Orrible discovery near King's Cross, a clue at last!" yelled the newspaper boys triumphantly. And then helplessly Mrs. Bunting began to laugh. She laughed and laughed and laughed, rocking herself to and fro as if in an ecstasy of mirth. "Why, father, whatever's the matter with her?" Daisy looked quite scared. "She's in 'sterics, that's what it is," he said shortly. "I'll just get the water jug. Wait a minute." Bunting felt very put out. Ellen was ridiculous, that's what she was, to be so easily upset. The lodger's bell suddenly pealed through the quiet house. Either that sound or maybe the threat of the water jug had a magical effect on Mrs. Bunting. She rose to her feet, still shaking all over, but mentally composed. "I'll go up," she said a little chokingly. "As for you, child, just run down into the kitchen. You'll find a piece of pork roasting in the oven. You might start paring the apples for the sauce." As Mrs. Bunting went upstairs, her legs felt as if they were made of cotton wool. She put out a trembling hand and clutched at the banister for support. But soon, making a great effort over herself, she began to feel more steady, and after waiting for a few moments on the landing, she knocked at the door of the drawing-room. Mr. Sleuth's voice answered her from the bedroom. "I'm not well," he called out querulously. "I think I've caught a chill. I should be obliged if you would kindly bring me up a cup of tea and put it outside my door, Mrs. Bunting." "Very well, sir." Mrs. Bunting turned and went downstairs. She still felt queer and giddy, so instead of going into the kitchen, she made the lodger his cup of tea over her sitting-room gas ring. During their midday dinner, the husband and wife had a little discussion as to where Daisy should sleep. It had been settled that a bed should be made up for her in the top back room, but Mrs. Bunting saw reason to change this plan. "I think 'twould be better if Daisy were to sleep with me, Bunting, and you was to sleep upstairs." Bunting felt and looked rather surprised, but he acquiesced. Ellen was probably right. The girl would be rather lonely up there, and, after all, they didn't know much about the lodger, though he seemed a respectable gentleman enough. Daisy was a good-natured girl. She liked London and wanted to make herself useful to her stepmother. "I'll wash up. Don't you bother to come downstairs," she said cheerfully. Bunting began to walk up and down the room. His wife gave him a furtive glance. She wondered what he was thinking about. "Didn't you get a paper?" she said at last. "Yes, of course I did," he answered hastily. "But I've put it away. I thought you'd rather not look at it as you're that nervous." Again she glanced at him quickly, furtively, but he seemed just as usual. He evidently meant just what he said and no more. "I thought they was shouting something in the street. I mean, just before I was took bad." It was now Bunting's turn to stare at his wife quickly and rather furtively. He had felt sure that her sudden attack of queerness, of hysterics, call it what you might, had been due to the shouting outside. She was not the only woman in London who had got the Avenger murders on her nerves. His morning paper said quite a lot of women were afraid to go out alone. Was it possible that the curious way she had been taken just now had had nothing to do with the shouts and excitement outside? "Don't you know what it was they were calling out?" he asked slowly. Mrs. Bunting looked across at him. She would have given a very great deal to be able to lie, to pretend that she did not know what those dreadful cries had portended, but when it came to the point she found she could not do so. "Yes," she said dully, "I heard a word here and there. There's been another murder, hasn't there?" "Two other murders," he said soberly. "Two? That's worse news." She turned so pale, a sallow greenish white, that Bunting thought she was again going queer. "Ellen," he said warningly. "Ellen, now do have a care. I can't think what's come over you about these murders. Turn your mind away from them, do. We needn't talk about them, not so much, that is." "But I wants to talk about them!" cried Mrs. Bunting hysterically. The husband and wife were standing, one each side of the table, the man with his back to the fire, the woman with her back to the door. Bunting, staring across at his wife, felt sadly perplexed and disturbed. She really did seem ill. Even her slight, spare figure looked shrunk. For the first time, so he told himself ruefully, Ellen was beginning to look her full age. Her slender hands, She had kept the pretty, soft, white hands of the woman who had never done rough work, grasped the edge of the table with a convulsive movement. Bunting didn't at all like the look of her. "Oh dear," he said to himself, "I do hope Ellen isn't going to be ill. That would be a to-do just now." "Tell me about it," she commanded in a low voice. "Can't you see I'm waiting to hear? Be quick now, Bunting." "There isn't very much to tell," he said reluctantly. "There's precious little in this paper, anyway. But the cabman what brought Daisy told me—" "Well?" "What I said just now. There's two of 'em this time, and they'd both been drinking heavily, poor creatures." "Was it where the others was done?" she asked, looking at her husband fearfully. "No," he said awkwardly. "No, it wasn't, Ellen. It was a good bit farther west. In fact, not so very far from here. Near King's Cross. That's how the cabman knew about it, you see. They seems to have been done in a passage which isn't used no more." And then, as he thought his wife's eyes were beginning to look rather funny, he added hastily, "There, that's enough for the present. We shall soon be hearing a lot more about it from Joe Chandler. He's pretty sure to come in some time today." "Then the 5,000 constables weren't no use," said Mrs. Bunting slowly. She had relaxed her grip of the table and was standing more upright. "No use at all," said Bunting briefly. "He is artful, and no mistake about it. But wait a minute." He turned and took up the paper which he had laid aside on a chair. "Yes, they says here that they has a clue." "A clue, Bunting?" Mrs. Bunting spoke in a soft, weak, die-away voice, and again, stooping somewhat, she grasped the edge of the table. But her husband was not noticing her now. He was holding the paper close up to his eyes, and he read from it, in a tone of considerable satisfaction. "It is gratifying to be able to state that the police at last believe they are in possession of a clue which will lead to the arrest of the—" And then Bunting dropped the paper and rushed round the table. His wife, with a curious, sighing moan, had slipped down on to the floor, taking with her the tablecloth as she went. She lay there in what appeared to be a dead faint. And Bunting, scared out of his wits, opened the door and screamed out, "Daisy, Daisy, come up, child. Ellen's took bad again." And Daisy, hurrying in, showed an amount of sense and resource which even at this anxious moment roused her fond father's admiration. "Get a wet sponge, Dad, quick!" she cried. "A sponge! And if you've got such a thing, a drop of brandy. I'll see after her." And then, after he had got the little medicine flask, "I can't think what's wrong with Ellen," said Daisy wonderingly. "She seemed quite all right when I first came in. She was listening, interested like, to what I was telling her, and then suddenly—well, you saw how she was took, father. 'Tain't like Ellen this, is it now?" "No," he whispered. "No, 'tain't. But you see, child, we've been going through a pretty bad time. Worse nor I should ever have let you know of, my dear. Ellen's just feeling it now, that's what it is. She didn't say nothing, for Ellen's a good plucked one, but it's told on her. It's told on her." And then Mrs. Bunting, sitting up, slowly opened her eyes, and instinctively put her hand up to her head to see if her hair was all right. She hadn't really been quite off. It would have been better for her if she had. She had simply had an awful feeling that she couldn't stand up. More, that she must fall down. Bunting's words touched a most unwonted chord in the poor woman's heart, and the eyes which she opened were full of tears. She had not thought her husband knew how she had suffered during those weeks of starving and waiting. But she had a morbid dislike of any betrayal of sentiment. To her such betrayal betokened foolishness, and so all she said was, "There's no need to make a fuss. I only turned over a little queer. I never was right off, Daisy." Pettishly she pushed away the glass in which Bunting had hurriedly poured a little brandy. "I wouldn't touch such stuff. No, not if I was dying," she exclaimed. Putting out a languid hand, she pulled herself up, with the help of the table, onto her feet. "Go down again to the kitchen, child." But there was a sob, a kind of tremor in her voice. "You haven't been eating properly, Ellen. That's what's the matter with you," said Bunting suddenly. "Now I come to think of it, you haven't eaten half enough these last 2 days. I always did say, in old days many a time I telled you, that a woman couldn't live on air. But there, you never believed me." Daisy stood looking from one to the other, a shadow over her bright, pretty face. "I'd no idea you'd had such a bad time, father," she said feelingly. "Why didn't you let me know about it? I might have got something out of Old Aunt." "We didn't want anything of that sort," said her stepmother hastily. "But of course, well, I expect I'm still feeling the worry now. I don't seem able to forget it. Those days of waiting, of—" She restrained herself. Another moment and the word starving would have left her lips. "But everything's all right now," said Bunting eagerly. "All right, thanks to Mr. Sleuth, that is." "Yes," repeated his wife in a low, strange tone of voice. "Yes, we're all right now, and as you say, Bunting, it's all along of Mr. Sleuth." She walked across to a chair and sat down on it. "I'm just a little tottery still," she muttered. And Daisy, looking at her, turned to her father and said in a whisper, but not so low but that Mrs. Bunting heard her, "Don't you think Ellen ought to see a doctor, father? He might give her something that would pull her round." "I won't see no doctor," said Mrs. Bunting with sudden emphasis. "I saw enough of doctors in my last place. 38 doctors in 10 months did my poor missus have. Just determined on having 'em, she was. Did they save her? No. She died just the same, maybe a bit sooner." "She was a freak, was your last mistress, Ellen," began Bunting aggressively. Ellen had insisted on staying on in that place till her poor mistress died. They might have been married some months before they were married but for that fact. Bunting had always resented it. His wife smiled wanly. "We won't have no words about that," she said, and again she spoke in a softer, kindlier tone than usual. "Daisy, if you won't go down to the kitchen again, then I must." She turned to her stepdaughter, and the girl flew out of the room. "I think the child grows prettier every minute," said Bunting fondly. "Folks are too apt to forget that beauty is but skin deep," said his wife. She was beginning to feel better. "But still, I do agree, Bunting, that Daisy's well enough, and she seems more willing, too." "I say, we mustn't forget the lodger's dinner," Bunting spoke uneasily. "It's a bit of fish to-day, isn't it? Hadn't I better just tell Daisy to see to it, and then I can take it up to him, as you're not feeling quite the thing, Ellen?" "I'm quite well enough to take up Mr. Sleuth's luncheon," she said quickly. It irritated her to hear her husband speak of the lodger's dinner. They had dinner in the middle of the day, but Mr. Sleuth had luncheon. However odd he might be, Mrs. Bunting never forgot her lodger was a gentleman. "After all, he likes me to wait on him, doesn't he? I can manage all right. Don't you worry," she added after a long pause. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Perhaps because his luncheon was served to him a good deal later than usual, Mr. Sleuth ate his nice piece of steamed sole upstairs with far heartier an appetite than his landlady had eaten her nice slice of roast pork downstairs. "I hope you're feeling a little better, sir," Mrs. Bunting had forced herself to say when she first took in his tray. And he had answered plaintively, querulously, "No, I can't say I feel well to-day, Mrs. Bunting. I am tired, very tired, and as I lay in bed I seem to hear so many sounds, so much crying and shouting. I trust the Marylebone Road is not going to become a noisy thoroughfare, Mrs. Bunting." "Oh, no, sir, I don't think that. We're generally reckoned very quiet indeed, sir." She waited a moment. Try as she would, she could not allude to what those unwonted shouts and noises had betokened. "I expect you've got a chill, sir," she said suddenly. "If I was you, I shouldn't go out this afternoon. I'd just stay quietly indoors. There's a lot of rough people about." Perhaps there was an undercurrent of warning, of painful pleading in her toneless voice which penetrated in some way to the brain of the lodger. For Mr. Sleuth looked up, and an uneasy, watchful look came into his luminous grey eyes. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mrs. Bunting, but I think I'll take your advice. That is, I will stay quietly at home. I am never at a loss to know what to do with myself so long as I can study the book of books." "Then you're not afraid about your eyes, sir?" said Mrs. Bunting curiously. Somehow she was beginning to feel better. It comforted her to be up here, talking to Mr. Sleuth, instead of thinking about him downstairs. It seemed to banish the terror which filled her soul, aye, and her body too, at other times. When she was with him Mr. Sleuth was so gentle, so reasonable, so grateful. Poor kindly, solitary Mr. Sleuth! This kind of gentleman surely wouldn't hurt a fly, let alone a human being. Eccentric, so much must be admitted. But Mrs. Bunting had seen a good deal of eccentric folk, eccentric women rather than eccentric men, in her long career as useful maid. Being in ordinary times an exceptionally sensible, well-balanced woman, she had never, in old days, allowed her mind to dwell on certain things she had learnt as to the aberrations of which human nature is capable, even well-born, well-nurtured, gentle human nature, as exemplified in some of the households where she had served. It would indeed be unfortunate if she now became morbid or hysterical. So it was in a sharp, cheerful voice, almost the voice in which she had talked during the first few days of Mr. Sleuth's stay in her house, that she exclaimed, "Well, sir, I'll be up again to clear away in about half an hour, and if you'll forgive me for saying so, I hope you will stay in and have a rest today. Nasty muggy weather, that's what it is. If there's any little thing you want, me or Bunting can go out and get it." It must have been about 4 o'clock when there came a ring at the front door. The three were sitting chatting together, for Daisy had washed up. She really was saving her stepmother a good bit of trouble, and the girl was now amusing her elders by a funny account of old Aunt's persnickety ways. "Whoever can that be?" said Bunting, looking up. "It's too early for Joe Chandler, surely." "I'll go," said his wife, hurriedly jumping up from her chair. "I'll go. We don't want no strangers in here." And as she stepped down the short bit of passage, she said to herself, "A clue? What clue?" But when she opened the front door, a glad sigh of relief broke from her. "Why, Joe! We never thought 'twas you. But you're very welcome, I'm sure. Come in." And Chandler came in, a rather sheepish look on his good-looking, fair young face. "I thought maybe that Mr. Bunting would like to know," he began in a loud, cheerful voice, and Mrs. Bunting hurriedly checked him. She didn't want the lodger upstairs to hear what young Chandler might be going to say. "Don't talk so loud," she said a little sharply. "The lodger is not very well today. He's had a cold," she added hastily, "and during the last 2 or 3 days he hasn't been able to go out." She wondered at her temerity, her hypocrisy, and that moment, those few words, marked an epoch in Ellen Bunting's life. It was the first time she had told a bold and deliberate lie. She was one of those women—there are many, many such—to whom there is a whole world of difference between the suppression of the truth and the utterance of an untruth. But Chandler paid no heed to her remarks. "Has Miss Daisy arrived?" he asked in a lower voice. She nodded. And then he went through into the room where the father and daughter were sitting. "Well," said Bunting, starting up. "Well, Joe, now you can tell us all about that mysterious clue. I suppose it'd be too good news to expect you to tell us they've caught him?" "No fear of such good news as that yet awhile. If they'd caught him," said Joe ruefully, "well, I don't suppose I should be here, Mr. Bunting. But the Yard are circulating a description at last, and, well, they've found his weapon." "No!" cried Bunting excitedly. "You don't say so! Whatever sort of thing is it? And are they sure 'tis his?" "Well, 'tain't sure, but it seems to be likely." Mrs. Bunting had slipped into the room and shut the door behind her, but she was still standing with her back against the door, looking at the group in front of her. None of them were thinking of her. She thanked God for that. She could hear everything that was said without joining in the talk and excitement. "Listen to this!" cried Joe Chandler exultantly. "'Tain't given out yet, not for the public, that is, but we was all given it by 8 o'clock this morning. Quick work, that, eh?" He read out: "Wanted. A man, of age approximately 28, slight in figure, height approximately 5 feet 8 inches, complexion dark, no beard or whiskers, wearing a black diagonal coat, hard felt hat, high white collar and tie. Carried a newspaper parcel. Very respectable appearance." Mrs. Bunting walked forward. She gave a long, fluttering sigh of unutterable relief. "There's the chap!" said Joe Chandler triumphantly. "And now, Miss Daisy," he turned to her jokingly, but there was a funny little tremor in his frank, cheerful-sounding voice, "if you knows of any nice, likely young fellow that answers to that description, well, you've only got to walk in and earn your reward of £500. "£500!" cried Daisy and her father simultaneously. "Yes, that's what the Lord Mayor offered yesterday. Some private bloke, nothing official about it. But we of the Yard is barred from taking that reward, worse luck. And it's too bad, for we has all the trouble, after all." "Just hand that bit of paper over, will you?" said Bunting. "I'd like to con it over to myself." Chandler threw over the bit of flimsy. A moment later Bunting looked up and handed it back. "Well, it's clear enough, isn't it?" "Yes, and there's hundreds, nay, thousands of young fellows that might be a description of," said Chandler sarcastically. "As a pal of mine said this morning, there isn't a chap will like to carry a newspaper parcel after this. And it won't do to have a respectable appearance, eh?" Daisy's voice rang out in merry, pealing laughter. She greatly appreciated Mr. Chandler's witticism. "Why on earth didn't the people who saw him try and catch him?" asked Bunting suddenly. And Mrs. Bunting broke in a lower voice. "Yes, Joe, that seems odd, don't it?" Joe Chandler coughed. "Well, it's this way," he said. "No one person did see all that. The man who's described here is just made up from the description of two different folk who think they saw him. You see, the murders must have taken place, well now, let me see, perhaps at 2 o'clock this last time. 2 o'clock, that's the idea. Well, at such a time as that not many people are about, especially on a foggy night. Yes, one woman declares she saw a young chap walking away from the spot where 'twas done, and another one, but that was a good bit later, says the Avenger passed by her. It's mostly her they're following in this 'ere description. And then the boss who has charge of that sort of thing looked up what other people had said, I mean when the other crimes was committed. That's how he made up this 'wanted.'" "Then the Avenger may be quite a different sort of man?" said Bunting slowly, disappointedly. "Well, of course he may be. But no, I think that description fits him all right," said Chandler, but he also spoke in a hesitating voice. "You was saying, Joe, that they found a weapon?" observed Bunting insinuatingly. He was glad that Ellen allowed the discussion to go on, in fact that she even seemed to take an intelligent interest in it. She had come up close to them, and now looked quite her old self again. "Yes, they believe they've found the weapon what he does his awful deeds with," said Chandler. "At any rate, within 100 yards of that little dark passage where they found the bodies, one at each end that was, there was discovered this morning a very peculiar kind of knife. Keen as a razor, pointed as a dagger. That's the exact words the boss used when he was describing it to a lot of us. He seemed to think a lot more of that clue than of the other. I mean, than of the description people gave of the chap who walked quickly by with a newspaper parcel. But now there's a pretty job in front of us. Every shop where they sell or might 'a' sold such a thing as that knife, including every eating house in the East End, has got to be called at." "Whatever for?" asked Daisy. "Why, with an idea of finding out if anyone saw such a knife fooling about there any time, and if so, in whose possession it was at the time. But Mr. Bunting," Chandler's voice changed. It became businesslike, official. "They're not going to say anything about that, not in newspapers, till tomorrow, so don't you go and tell anybody. You see, we don't want to frighten the fellow off. If he knew they'd got his knife, well, he might just make himself scarce, and they don't want that. If it's discovered that any knife of that kind was sold, say a month ago, to some customer whose ways are known, then—" "What'll happen then?" said Mrs. Bunting, coming nearer. "Well, then, nothing'll be put about it in the papers at all," said Chandler deliberately. "The only object of letting the public know about it would be if nothing was found. I mean, if the search of the shops and so on was no good. Then, of course, we must try and find out someone, some private person like, who's watched that knife in the criminal's possession. It's there the reward, the £500, will come in." "Oh, I'd give anything to see that knife!" exclaimed Daisy, clasping her hands together. "You cruel, bloodthirsty girl!" cried her stepmother passionately. They all looked round at her, surprised. "Come, come, Ellen," said Bunting reprovingly. "Well, it is a horrible idea," said his wife sullenly, "to go and sell a fellow being for £500. But Daisy was offended. "Of course I'd like to see it," she cried defiantly. "I never said nothing about the reward. That was Mr. Chandler said that. I only said I'd like to see the knife." Chandler looked at her soothingly. "Well, the day may come when you will see it," he said slowly. A great idea had come into his mind. "No? What makes you think that?" "If they catches him, and if you comes along with me to see our Black Museum at the Yard, you'll certainly see the knife, Miss Daisy. They keeps all them kind of things there. So if, as I say, this weapon should lead to the conviction of the Avenger, well then, that knife will be there and you'll see it." "The Black Museum? Why, whatever do they have a museum in your place for?" asked Daisy wonderingly. "I thought there was only the British Museum." And then even Mrs. Bunting, as well as Bunting and Chandler, laughed aloud. "You are a goosey girl," said her father fondly. "Why, there's a lot of museums in London. The town's thick with 'em. Ask Ellen there. She and me used to go to them kind of places when we was courting, if the weather was bad." "But our museum's the one that would interest Miss Daisy," broke in Chandler eagerly. "It's a regular chamber of 'orrors." "Why, Joe, you never told us about that place before," said Bunting excitedly. "Do you really mean that there's a museum where they keep all sorts of things connected with crimes? Things like knives murders have been committed with?" "Knives!" cried Joe, pleased at having become the center of attention, for Daisy had also fixed her blue eyes on him, and even Mrs. Bunting looked at him expectantly. "Much more than knives, Mr. Bunting. Why, they've got there in little bottles the real poison what people have been done away with." "And can you go there whenever you like?" asked Daisy wonderingly. She had not realized before what extraordinary and agreeable privileges are attached to the position of a detective member of the London police force. "Well, I suppose I could," Joe smiled. "Anyway, I can certainly get leave to take a friend there." He looked meaningly at Daisy, and Daisy looked eagerly at him. But would Ellen ever let her go out by herself with Mr. Chandler? Ellen was so prim, so irritatingly proper. But what was this father was saying? "Do you really mean that, Joe?" "Yes, of course I do." "Well, then, look here. If it isn't asking too much of a favor, I should like to go along there with you very much one day. I don't want to wait till the Avenger's caught." Bunting smiled broadly. "I'd be quite content as it is with what there is in that museum o' yours. Ellen there," he looked across at his wife, "don't agree with me about such things. Yet I don't think I'm a bloodthirsty man. But I'm just terribly interested in all that sort of thing, always have been. I used to positively envy the butler in that Balham mystery." Again a look passed between Daisy and the young man. It was a look which contained and carried a great many things backwards and forwards, such as, "Now isn't it funny that your father should want to go to such a place? But still, I can't help it if he does want to go, so we must put up with his company, though it would have been much nicer for us to go just by our two selves." And then Daisy's look answered quite as plainly, though perhaps Joe didn't read her glance quite as clearly as she had read his. "Yes, it is tiresome, but father means well, and 'twill be very pleasant going there even if he does come too." "Well, what do you say to the day after tomorrow, Mr. Bunting? I'd call for you here about, shall we say 2:30, and just take you and Miss Daisy down to the yard. 'Twouldn't take very long. We could go all the way by bus, right down to Westminster Bridge." He looked round at his hostess. "Wouldn't you join us, Mrs. Bunting? 'Tis truly a wonderful, interesting place." But his hostess shook her head decidedly. "'Twould turn me sick," she exclaimed, "to see the bottle of poison what had done away with the life of some poor creature. And as for knives—" A look of real horror, of startled fear crept over her pale face. "There, there," said Bunting hastily. "Live and let live. That's what I always say. Ellen ain't on in this turn. She can just stay at home and mind the cat. I beg his pardon, I mean the lodger." "I won't have Mr. Sleuth laughed at," said Mrs. Bunting darkly. "But there, I'm sure it's very kind of you, Joe, to think of giving Bunting and Daisy such a rare treat." She spoke sarcastically, but none of the three who heard her understood that. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. The moment she passed through the great arched door which admits the stranger to that portion of New Scotland Yard where throbs the heart of that great organism which fights the forces of civilized crime, Daisy Bunting felt that she had indeed become free of the kingdom of romance. Even the lift in which the three of them were whirled up to one of the upper floors of the huge building was, to the girl, a new and delightful experience. Daisy had always lived a simple, quiet life in the little country town where dwelt Old Aunt, and this was the first time a lift had come her way. With a touch of personal pride in the vast building, Joe Chandler marched his friends down a wide, airy corridor. Daisy clung to her father's arm, a little bewildered, a little oppressed by her good fortune. Her happy young voice was stilled by the awe she felt at the wonderful place where she found herself, and by the glimpses she caught of great rooms full of busy, silent men engaged in unravelling, or so she supposed, the mysteries of crime. They were passing a half-open door when Chandler suddenly stopped short. "Look in there," he said in a low voice, addressing the father rather than the daughter. "That's the fingerprint room. We've records here of over 200,000 men's and women's fingertips. I expect you know, Mr. Bunting, as how, once we've got the print of a man's 5 fingertips, well, he's done for, if he ever does anything else, that is. Once we've got that bit of him registered, he can't never escape us. No, not if he tries ever so. But though there's a nigh on 250,000 records in there, yet it don't take, well, not half an hour, for them to tell whether any particular man has ever been convicted before. Wonderful thought, ain't it?" "Wonderful," said Bunting, drawing a deep breath. And then a troubled look came over his stolid face. "Wonderful, but also a very fearful thought for the poor wretches as has got their fingerprints in, Joe." Joe laughed. "Agreed," he said, "and the cleverer ones knows that only too well. Why, not long ago one man who knew his record was here safe managed to slash about his fingers something awful, just so as to make a blurred impression, you takes my meaning? But there, at the end of 6 weeks, the skin grew all right again, and in exactly the same little creases as before." "Poor devil!" said Bunting under his breath, and a cloud even came over Daisy's bright, eager face. They were now going along a narrower passage, and then again they came to a half-open door, leading into a room far smaller than that of the fingerprint identification room. "If you'll glance in there," said Joe briefly, "you'll see how he finds out all about any man whose fingertips has given him away, so to speak. It's here we keeps an account of what he's done, his previous convictions, and so on. His fingertips are where I told you, and his record in there, just connected by a number." "Wonderful!" said Bunting, drawing in his breath. But Daisy was longing to get on, to get to the Black Museum. All this that Joe and her father were saying was quite unreal to her, and, for the matter of that, not worth taking the trouble to understand. However, she had not long to wait. A broad-shouldered, pleasant-looking young fellow, who seemed on very friendly terms with Joe Chandler, came forward suddenly, and, unlocking a commonplace-looking door, ushered the little party of 3 through into the Black Museum. For a moment there came across Daisy a feeling of keen disappointment and surprise. This big, light room simply reminded her of what they called the science room in the public library of the town where she lived with Old Aunt. Here, as there, the center was taken up with plain glass cases fixed at a height from the floor which enabled their contents to be looked at closely. She walked forward and peered into the case nearest the door. The exhibits shown there were mostly small, shabby-looking little things, the sort of things one might turn out of an old rubbish cupboard in an untidy house. Old medicine bottles, a soiled neckerchief, what looked like a child's broken lantern, even a box of pills. As for the walls, they were covered with the queerest-looking objects, bits of old iron, odd-looking things made of wood and leather, and so on. It was really rather disappointing. Then Daisy Bunting gradually became aware that standing on a shelf just below the first of the broad, spacious windows which made the great room look so light and shadowless, was a row of life-size white plaster heads, each head slightly inclined to the right. There were about a dozen of these, not more, and they had such odd, staring, helpless, real-looking faces. "Whatever's those?" asked Bunting in a low voice. Daisy clung a thought closer to her father's arm. Even she guessed that these strange, pathetic, staring faces were the death masks of those men and women who had fulfilled the awful law which ordains that the murderer shall be in his turn done to death. "All hanged," said the guardian of the Black Museum briefly. "Casts taken after death." Bunting smiled nervously. "They don't look dead, somehow. They looks more as if they were listening," he said. "That's the fault of Jack Ketch," said the man facetiously. "It's his idea. That of knotting his patient's necktie under the left ear. That's what he does to each of the gentlemen to whom he is to act valet on just one occasion only. It makes them lean just a bit to one side. You look here." Daisy and her father came a little closer, and the speaker pointed with his finger to a little dent imprinted on the left side of each neck. Running from this indentation was a curious little furrow, well ridged above, showing how tightly Jack Ketch's necktie had been drawn when its wearer was hurried through the gates of eternity. "They looks foolish-like, rather than terrified or hurt," said Bunting wonderingly. He was extraordinarily moved and fascinated by those dumb, staring faces. But young Chandler exclaimed in a cheerful, matter-of-fact voice, "Well, a man would look foolish at such a time as that, with all his plans brought to naught, and knowing he's only got a second to live, now wouldn't he?" "Yes, I suppose he would," said Bunting slowly. Daisy had gone a little pale. The sinister, breathless atmosphere of the place was beginning to tell on her. She now began to understand that the shabby little objects lying there in the glass case close to her were each and all links in the chain of evidence which, in almost every case, had brought some guilty man or woman to the gallows. "We had a yellow gentleman here the other day," observed the guardian suddenly. "One of those Brahmins, so they calls themselves. Well, you'd have been quite surprised to see how that heathen took on. He declared—what was the word he used?" He turned to Chandler. "He said that each of these things, with the exception of the casts, mind you, queer to say, he left them out, exuded evil. That was the word he used. Exuded. Squeezed out, it means. He said that being here made him feel very bad. And 'twasn't all nonsense, either. He turned quite green under his yellow skin, and we had to shove him out quick. He didn't feel better till he'd got right to the other end of the passage." "There now! Who'd ever think of that?" said Bunting. "I should say that man had got something on his conscience, wouldn't you?" "Well, I needn't stay now," said Joe's good-natured friend. "You show your friends round, Chandler. You knows the place nearly as well as I do, don't you?" He smiled at Joe's visitors as if to say good-bye, but it seemed that he could not tear himself away after all. "Look here," he said to Bunting, "in this here little case are the tools of Charles Peace. I expect you've heard of him." "I should think I have!" cried Bunting eagerly. "Many gents as comes here thinks this case the most interesting of all. Peace was such a wonderful man. A great inventor, they say he would have been, had he been put in the way of it. Here's his ladder. You see it folds up quite compactly, and makes a nice little bundle, just like a bundle of old sticks any man might have been seen carrying about London in those days without attracting any attention. Why, it probably helped him to look like an honest working man time and time again, for on being arrested he declared most solemnly he'd always carried that ladder openly under his arm." "The daring of that!" cried Bunting. "Yes, and when the ladder was opened out it could reach from the ground to the second story of any old house. And oh, how clever he was! Just open one section, and you see the other sections open automatically. So Peace could stand on the ground and force the thing quietly up to any window he wished to reach. Then he'd go away again, having done his job, with a mere bundle of old wood under his arm. My word, he was artful. I wonder if you've heard the tale of how Peace once lost a finger? Well, he guessed the constables were instructed to look out for a man missing a finger, so what did he do?" "Put on a false finger," suggested Bunting. "No, indeed! Peace made up his mind just to do without a hand altogether. Here's his false stump. You see it's made of wood and black felt? Well, that just held his hand nicely. Why, we considers that one of the most ingenious contrivances in the whole museum." Meanwhile, Daisy had let go her hold of her father. With Chandler in delighted attendance, she had moved away to the farther end of the great room, and now she was bending over yet another glass case. "Whatever are those little bottles for?" she asked wonderingly. There were 5 small phials, filled with varying quantities of cloudy liquids. "They're full of poison, Miss Daisy, that's what they are. There's enough arsenic in that little whack of brandy to do for you and me, aye, and for your father as well, I should say." "Then chemists shouldn't sell such stuff," said Daisy, smiling. Poison was so remote from herself that the sight of these little bottles only brought a pleasant thrill. "No more they don't. That was sneaked out of a fly-paper, that was. Lady said she wanted a cosmetic for her complexion, but what she was really going for was fly-papers for to do away with her husband. She'd got a bit tired of him, I suspect." "Perhaps he was a horrid man and deserved to be done away with," said Daisy. The idea struck them both as so very comic that they began to laugh aloud in unison. "Did you ever hear what a certain Mrs. Pearce did?" asked Chandler, becoming suddenly serious. "Oh, yes," said Daisy, and she shuddered a little. "That was the wicked, wicked woman what killed a pretty little baby and its mother. They've got her in Madame Tussaud's. But Ellen, she won't let me go to the Chamber of Horrors. She wouldn't let father take me there last time I was in London. Cruel of her, I called it. But somehow I don't feel as if I wanted to go there now, after having been here." "Well," said Chandler slowly, "we've a case full of relics of Mrs. Pearce. But the pram the bodies were found in, that's at Madame Tussaud's. At least so they claim. I can't say. Now here's something just as curious, and not near so dreadful. See that man's jacket there?" "Yes," said Daisy falteringly. She was beginning to feel oppressed, frightened. She no longer wondered that the Indian gentleman had been taken queer. "A burglar shot a man dead who'd disturbed him, and by mistake he went and left that jacket behind him. Our people noticed that one of the buttons was broken in two. Well, that don't seem much of a clue, does it, Miss Daisy? Will you believe me when I tells you that that other bit of button was discovered, and that it hanged the fellow? And 'twas the more wonderful because all three buttons was different." Daisy stared wonderingly down at the little broken button which had hung a man. "And whatever's that?" she asked, pointing to a piece of dirty-looking stuff. "Well," said Chandler reluctantly, "that's rather a horrible thing, that is. That's a bit of shirt that was buried with a woman, buried in the ground, I mean, after her husband had cut her up and tried to burn her. 'Twas that bit of shirt that brought him to the gallows." "I considers your museum's a very horrid place," said Daisy pettishly, turning away. She longed to be out in the passage again, away from this brightly lighted, cheerful-looking, sinister room. But her father was now absorbed in the case containing various types of infernal machines. "Beautiful little works of art, some of them are," said his guide eagerly, and Bunting could not but agree. "Come along, do, father," said Daisy quickly. "I've seen about enough now. If I was to stay in here much longer it'd give me the horrors. I don't want to have no nightmares tonight. It's dreadful to think there are so many wicked people in the world. Why, we might knock up against some murderer any minute without knowing it, mightn't we?" "Not you, Miss Daisy," said Chandler smilingly. "I don't suppose you'll ever come across even a common swindler, let alone anyone who's committed a murder. Not one in a million does that. Why, even I have never had anything to do with a proper murder case." But Bunting was in no hurry. He was thoroughly enjoying every moment of the time. Just now he was studying intently the various photographs which hung on the walls of the Black Museum. Especially was he pleased to see those connected with a famous and still mysterious case which had taken place not long before in Scotland, and in which the servant of the man who died had played a considerable part, not in elucidating, but in obscuring the mystery. "I suppose a good many murderers get off?" he said musingly. And Joe Chandler's friend nodded. "I should think they did!" he exclaimed. "There's no such thing as justice here in England. 'Tis odds on the murderer every time. 'Tisn't 1 in 10 that come to the end he should do—to the gallows, that is." "And what do you think about what's going on now? I mean about those Avenger murders?" Bunting lowered his voice, but Daisy and Chandler were already moving towards the door. "I don't believe he'll ever be caught," said the other confidentially. "In some ways 'tis a lot more of a job to catch a madman than 'tis to run down just an ordinary criminal. And of course, leastways to my thinking, the Avenger is a madman, one of the cunning, quiet sort. Have you heard about the letter?" His voice dropped lower. "No," said Bunting, staring eagerly at him. "What letter do you mean?" "Well, there's a letter—it'll be in this museum some day—which came just before that last double event. 'Twas signed The Avenger, and just the same printed characters as on that bit of paper he always leaves behind him. Mind you, it don't follow that it actually was the Avenger what sent that letter here, but it looks uncommonly like it, and I know that the boss attaches quite a lot of importance to it." "And where was it posted?" asked Bunting. "That might be a bit of a clue, you know." "Oh, no," said the other. "They always goes a very long way to post anything, criminals do. It stands to reason they would. But this particular one was put in the Edgware Road post office." "What? Close to us?" said Bunting. "Goodness! Dreadful!" "Any of us might knock up against him any minute. I don't suppose the Avenger's in any way peculiar looking. In fact, we know he ain't." "Then you think that woman as says she saw him did see him?" asked Bunting hesitatingly. "Our description was made up from what she said," answered the other cautiously. "But there, you can't tell. In a case like that it's groping in the dark all the time, and it's just a lucky accident if it comes out right in the end. Of course it's upsetting us all very much here. You can't wonder at that." "No, indeed," said Bunting quickly. "I give you my word I've hardly thought of anything else for the last month." Daisy had disappeared, and when her father joined her in the passage she was listening with downcast eyes to what Joe Chandler was saying. He was telling her about his real home, of the place where his mother lived, at Richmond, that it was a nice little house, close to the park. He was asking her whether she could manage to come out there one afternoon, explaining that his mother would give them tea and how nice it would be. "I don't see why Ellen shouldn't let me," the girl said rebelliously. "But she's that old-fashioned and persnickety, is Ellen, a regular old maid. And you see, Mr. Chandler, when I'm staying with them, father don't like for me to do anything that Ellen don't approve of. But she's got quite fond of you, so perhaps if you ask her—" She looked at him and he nodded sagely. "Don't you be afraid," he said confidently. "I'll get around Mrs. Bunting. But, Miss Daisy," he grew very red, "I'd just like to ask you a question, no offense meant." "Yes?" said Daisy a little breathlessly. "There's father close to us, Mr. Chandler. Tell me quick, what is it?" "Well, I take it by what you said just now, that you've never walked out with any young fellow?" Daisy hesitated a moment, then a very pretty dimple came into her cheek. "No," she said sadly. "No, Mr. Chandler, that I have not." In a burst of candour she added, "You see, I never had the chance." And Joe Chandler smiled, well pleased. Chapter 10. By what she regarded as a fortunate chance, Mrs. Bunting found herself for close on an hour quite alone in the house during her husband's and Daisy's jaunt with young Chandler. Mr. Sleuth did not often go out in the daytime, but on this particular afternoon, after he had finished his tea, when dusk was falling, he suddenly observed that he wanted a new suit of clothes, and his landlady eagerly acquiesced in his going out to purchase it. As soon as he had left the house, she went quickly up to the drawing-room floor. Now had come her opportunity of giving the two rooms a good dusting. But Mrs. Bunting knew well, deep in her heart, that it was not so much the dusting of Mr. Sleuth's sitting-room she wanted to do, as to engage in a vague search for—she hardly knew for what. During the years she had been in service, Mrs. Bunting had always had a deep, wordless contempt for those of her fellow servants who read their employers' private letters, and who furtively peeped into desks and cupboards in the hope, more vague than positive, of discovering family skeletons. But now, with regard to Mr. Sleuth, she was ready, aye, eager, to do herself what she had once so scorned others for doing. Beginning with the bedroom, she started on a methodical search. He was a very tidy gentleman, was the lodger, and his few things, undergarments and so on, were in apple-pie order. She had early undertaken, much to his satisfaction, to do the very little bit of washing he required done, with her own and Bunting's. Luckily he wore soft shirts. At one time Mrs. Bunting had always had a woman in to help her with this tiresome weekly job, but lately she had grown quite clever at it herself. The only things she had to send out were Bunting's shirts. Everything else she managed to do herself. From the chest of drawers she now turned her attention to the dressing-table. Mr. Sleuth did not take his money with him when he went out. He generally left it in one of the drawers below the old-fashioned looking-glass. And now, in a perfunctory way, his landlady pulled out the little drawer, but she did not touch what was lying there. She only glanced at the heap of sovereigns and a few bits of silver. The lodger had taken just enough money with him to buy the clothes he required. He had consulted her as to how much they would cost, making no secret of why he was going out, and the fact had vaguely comforted Mrs. Bunting. Now she lifted the toilet cover, and even rolled up the carpet a little way, but no, there was nothing there, not so much as a scrap of paper. And at last, when more or less giving up the search as she came and went between the two rooms, leaving the connecting door wide open, her mind became full of uneasy speculation and wonder as to the lodger's past life. Odd Mr. Sleuth must surely always have been, but odd in a sensible sort of way, having on the whole the same moral ideals of conduct as have other people of his class. He was queer about the drink, one might say almost crazy on the subject, but there, as to that, he wasn't the only one. She, Ellen Bunting, had once lived with a lady who was just like that, who was quite crazed, that is, on the question of drink and drunkards. She looked round the neat drawing-room with vague dissatisfaction. There was only one place where anything could be kept concealed. That place was the substantial, if small, mahogany chiffonier, And then an idea suddenly came to Mrs. Bunting, one she had never thought of before. After listening intently for a moment, lest something should suddenly bring Mr. Sleuth home earlier than she expected, she went to the corner where the chiffonier stood, and exerting the whole of her not very great physical strength, she tipped forward the heavy piece of furniture. As she did so, she heard a queer rumbling sound, something rolling about on the second shelf, something which had not been there before Mr. Sleuth's arrival. Slowly, laboriously, she tipped the chiffonier backwards and forwards, once, twice, thrice, satisfied, yet strangely troubled in her mind, for she now felt sure that the bag of which the disappearance had so surprised her was there, safely locked away by its owner. Suddenly a very uncomfortable thought came to Mrs. Bunting's mind. She hoped Mr. Sleuth would not notice that his bag had shifted inside the cupboard. A moment later, with sharp dismay, Mr. Sleuth's landlady realized that the fact that she had moved the chiffonier must become known to her lodger, for a thin trickle of some dark-colored liquid was oozing out through the bottom of the little cupboard door. She stooped down and touched the stuff. It showed red, bright red, on her finger. Mrs. Bunting grew chalky white, then recovered herself quickly. In fact, the color rushed into her face and she grew hot all over. It was only a bottle of red ink she had upset, that was all. How could she have thought it was anything else? It was the more silly of her, so she told herself in scornful condemnation, because she knew that the lodger used red ink. Certain pages of Cruden's Concordance were covered with notes written in Mr. Sleuth's peculiar upright handwriting. In fact, in some places you couldn't see the margin, so closely covered was it with remarks and notes of interrogation. Mr. Sleuth had foolishly placed his bottle of red ink in the chiffonier. That was what her poor, foolish gentleman had done, and it was owing to her inquisitiveness, her restless wish to know things she would be none the better, none the happier for knowing, that this accident had taken place. She mopped up with her duster the few drops of ink which had fallen on the green carpet, and then, still feeling, as she angrily told herself, foolishly upset, she went once more into the back room. It was curious that Mr. Sleuth possessed no notepaper. She would have expected him to have made that one of his first purchases, the more so that paper is so very cheap, especially that rather dirty-looking grey Silurian paper. Mrs. Bunting had once lived with a lady who always used two kinds of notepaper, white for her friends and equals, grey for those whom she called common people. She, Ellen Green as she then was, had always resented the fact. Strange she should remember it now, stranger in a way because that employer of hers had not been a real lady, and Mr. Sleuth, whatever his peculiarities, was in every sense of the word a real gentleman. Somehow Mrs. Bunting felt sure that if he had bought any notepaper it would have been white, white and probably cream-laid, not grey and cheap. Again she opened the drawer of the old-fashioned wardrobe and lifted up the few pieces of underclothing Mr. Sleuth now possessed. But there was nothing there. Nothing, that is, hidden away. When one came to think of it, there seemed something strange in the notion of leaving all one's money where anyone could take it, and in locking up such a valueless thing as a cheap sham leather bag, to say nothing of a bottle of ink. Mrs. Bunting once more opened out each of the tiny drawers below the looking-glass, each delicately fashioned of fine old mahogany. Mr. Sleuth kept his money in the centre drawer. The glass had only cost 7 and 6pence, and after the auction a dealer had come and offered her first 15 shillings and then a guinea for it. Not long ago in Baker Street she had seen a looking-glass which was the very spit of this one, labelled Chippendale, Antique, £21, 5 shillings, 0 pence. There lay Mr. Sleuth's money. The sovereigns, as the landlady well knew, would each and all gradually pass into hers and Bunting's possession, honestly earned by them, no doubt, but unattainable, in act unearnable, excepting in connection with the present owner of those dully shining gold sovereigns. At last she went downstairs to await Mr. Sleuth's return. When she heard the key turn in the door she came out into the passage. "I'm sorry to say I've had an accident, sir," she said, a little breathlessly. "Taking advantage of your being out, I went up to dust the drawing-room, and while I was trying to get behind the chiffonier it tilted. I'm afraid, sir, that a bottle of ink that was inside may have got broken, for just a few drops oozed out, sir. But I hope there's no harm done. I wiped it up as well as I could, seeing that the doors of the chiffonier are locked." Mr. Sleuth stared at her with a wild, almost a terrified glance. But Mrs. Bunting stood her ground. She felt far less afraid now than she had felt before he came in. Then she had been so frightened that she had nearly gone out of the house, onto the pavement, for company. "Of course I had no idea, sir, that you kept any ink in there." She spoke as if she were on the defensive, and the lodger's brow cleared. "I was aware you used ink, sir," Mrs. Bunting went on, "for I have seen you marking that book of yours—I mean the book you read together with the Bible. Would you like me to go out and get you another bottle, sir?" "No," said Mr. Sleuth. "No, I thank you. I will at once proceed upstairs and see what damage has been done. When I require you I shall ring." He shuffled past her, and 5 minutes later the drawing-room bell did ring. At once, from the door, Mrs. Bunting saw that the chiffonier was wide open, and that the shelves were empty save for the bottle of red ink which had turned over and now lay in a red pool of its own making on the lower shelf. "I'm afraid it will have stained the wood, Mrs. Bunting. Perhaps I was ill-advised to keep my ink in there." "Oh, no, sir, that doesn't matter at all. Only a drop or two fell out onto the carpet, and they don't show, as you see, sir, for it's a dark corner. Shall I take the bottle away? I may as well." Mr. Sleuth hesitated. "No," he said after a long pause, "I think not, Mrs. Bunting. For the very little I require it, the ink remaining in the bottle will do quite well, especially if I add a little water, or better still, a little tea, to what already remains in the bottle. I only require it to mark up passages which happen to be of peculiar interest in my concordance—a work, Mrs. Bunting, which I should have taken great pleasure in compiling myself had not this gentleman called Cruden been before." Not only Bunting, but Daisy also, thought Ellen far pleasanter in her manner than usual that evening. She listened to all they had to say about their interesting visit to the Black Museum, and did not snub either of them. No, not even when Bunting told of the dreadful, haunting, silly-looking death masks taken from the hanged. But a few minutes after that, when her husband suddenly asked her a question, Mrs. Bunting answered at random. It was clear she had not heard the last few words he had been saying. "A penny for your thoughts," he said jocularly. But she shook her head. Daisy slipped out of the room, and 5 minutes later came back dressed up in a blue and white check silk gown. "My!" said her father. "You do look fine, Daisy. I've never seen you wearing that before." "And a rare figure of fun she looks in it," observed Mrs. Bunting sarcastically. And then, "I suppose this dressing up means that you're expecting someone. I should have thought both of you must have seen enough of young Chandler for one day. I wonder when that young chap does his work, that I do. He never seems too busy to come and waste an hour or two here." But that was the only nasty thing Ellen said all that evening, and even Daisy noticed that her stepmother seemed dazed and unlike herself. She went about her cooking and the various little things she had to do even more silently than was her wont. Yet under that still, almost sullen manner, how fierce was the storm of dread, of sombre anguish, and yes, of sick suspense which shook her soul, and which so far affected her poor, ailing body that often she felt as if she could not force herself to accomplish her simple round of daily work. After they had finished supper, Bunting went out and bought a penny evening paper, but as he came in he announced, with a rather rueful smile, that he had read so much of that nasty little print this last week or two that his eyes hurt him. "Let me read aloud a bit to you, father," said Daisy eagerly, and he handed her the paper. Scarcely had Daisy opened her lips when a loud ring and a knock echoed through the house. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11. It was only Joe. Somehow even Bunting called him Joe now, and no longer Chandler, as he had mostly used to do. Mrs. Bunting had opened the front door only a very little way. She wasn't going to have any strangers pushing in past her. To her sharpened, suffering senses her house had become a citadel which must be defended, aye, even if the besiegers were a mighty horde with right on their side, and she was always expecting that first single spy who would herald the battalion against whom her only weapon would be her woman's wit and cunning. But when she saw who stood there smiling at her, the muscles of her face relaxed, and it lost the tense, anxious, almost agonized look it assumed the moment she turned her back on her husband and stepdaughter. "Why, Joe," she whispered, for she had left the door open behind her, and Daisy had already begun to read aloud, as her father had bidden her. "Come in, do. It's fairly cold tonight." A glance at his face had shown her that there was no fresh news. Joe Chandler walked in, past her, into the little hall. Cold? Well, he didn't feel cold, for he had walked quickly to be the sooner where he was now. 9 days had gone by since that last terrible occurrence, the double murder which had been committed early in the morning of the day Daisy had arrived in London. And though the thousands of men belonging to the Metropolitan Police, to say nothing of the smaller, more alert body of detectives attached to the force, were keenly on the alert, not one but had begun to feel that there was nothing to be alert about. Familiarity, even with horror, breeds contempt. But with the public it was far otherwise. Each day something happened to revive and keep alive the mingled horror and interest this strange, enigmatic series of crimes had evoked. Even the more sober organs of the press went on attacking, with gathering severity and indignation, the Commissioner of Police, and at the huge demonstration held in Victoria Park 2 days before, violent speeches had also been made against the Home Secretary. But just now Joe Chandler wanted to forget all that. The little house in the Marylebone Road had become to him an enchanted isle of dreams, to which his thoughts were ever turning when he had a moment to spare from what had grown to be a wearisome, because an unsatisfactory, job. He secretly agreed with one of his pals who had exclaimed, and that within 48 hours of the last double crime, "Why, 'twould be easier to find a needle in a rick o' hay than this bloke." And if that had been true then, how much truer it was now, after 9 long, empty days had gone by. Quickly he divested himself of his greatcoat, muffler, and low hat. Then he put his finger on his lip and motioned smilingly to Mrs. Bunting to wait a moment. From where he stood in the hall the father and daughter made a pleasant little picture of contented domesticity. Joe Chandler's honest heart swelled at the sight. Daisy, wearing the blue and white check silk dress about which her stepmother and she had had words, sat on a low stool on the left side of the fire, while Bunting, leaning back in his own comfortable armchair, was listening, his hand to his ear, in an attitude, as it was the first time she had caught him doing it, the fact brought a pang to Mrs. Bunting, which showed that age was beginning to creep over the listener. One of Daisy's duties as companion to her great aunt was that of reading the newspaper aloud, and she prided herself on her accomplishment. Just as Joe had put his finger on his lip, Daisy had been asking, "Shall I read this, father?" and Bunting had answered quickly, "Aye, do, my dear." He was absorbed in what he was hearing, and, on seeing Joe at the door, he had only just nodded his head. The young man was becoming so frequent a visitor as to be almost one of themselves. Daisy read out, "The Avenger, and then she stopped short, for the next word puzzled her greatly. Bravely, however, she went on, "A theory." "Go in, do," whispered Mrs. Bunting to her visitor. "Why should we stay out here in the cold? It's ridiculous." "I don't want to interrupt Miss Daisy," whispered Chandler back, rather hoarsely. "Well, you'll hear it all the better in the room. Don't think she'll stop because of you, bless you. There's nothing shy about our Daisy." The young man resented the tart, short tone. "Poor little girl," he said to himself tenderly. "That's what it is, having a stepmother instead of a proper mother." But he obeyed Mrs. Bunting, and then he was pleased he had done so, for Daisy looked up, and a bright blush came over her pretty face. "Joe begs you won't stop yet awhile. Go on with your reading," commanded Mrs. Bunting quickly. "Now, Joe, you can go and sit over there, close to Daisy, and then you won't miss a word." There was a sarcastic inflection in her voice. Even Chandler noticed that, but he obeyed her with alacrity, and crossing the room he went and sat on a chair just behind Daisy. From there he could note with reverent delight the charming way her fair hair grew upwards from the nape of her slender neck. "The Avenger, a theory," began Daisy again, clearing her throat. "Dear Sir, I have a suggestion to put forward for which I think there is a great deal to be said. It seems to me very probable that the Avenger, to give him the name by which he apparently wishes to be known, comprises, in his own person, the peculiarities of Jekyll and Hyde, Mr. Louis Stevenson's now famous hero. The culprit, according to my point of view, is a quiet, pleasant-looking gentleman who lives somewhere in the West End of London. He has, however, a tragedy in his past life. He is the husband of a dipsomaniac wife. She is, of course, under care, and is never mentioned in the house where he lives, maybe with his widowed mother and perhaps a maiden sister. They notice that he has become gloomy and brooding of late, but he lives his usual life, occupying himself each day with some harmless hobby. On foggy nights, once the quiet household is plunged in sleep, he creeps out of the house, maybe between 1 and 2 o'clock, and swiftly makes his way straight to what has become the Avenger's murder area. Picking out a likely victim, he approaches her with Judas-like gentleness, and having committed his awful crime, goes quietly home again. After a good bath and breakfast, he turns up happy, once more the quiet individual who is an excellent son, a kind brother, esteemed and even beloved by a large circle of friends and acquaintances. Meantime, the police are searching about the scene of the tragedy for what they regard as the usual type of criminal lunatic. I give this theory, sir, for what it is worth, but I confess that I am amazed the police have so wholly confined their inquiries to the part of London where these murders have been actually committed. I am quite sure from all that has come out, and we must remember that full information is never given to the newspapers, the Avenger should be sought for in the West and not in the East End of London. Believe me to remain, sir, yours very truly. Again Daisy hesitated, and then with an effort she brought out the word. Gaboriau, said she. What a funny name, said Bunting wonderingly. And then Joe broke in. That's the name of a French chap what wrote detective stories, he said. Pretty good some of them are, too. Then this Gaboriau has come over to study these Avenger murders, I take it, said Bunting. Oh, no, Joe spoke with confidence. Whoever's written that silly letter just signed that name for fun. It is a silly letter, Mrs. Bunting had broken in resentfully. I wonder a respectable paper prints such rubbish. Fancy if the Avenger did turn out to be a gentleman, cried Daisy in an awestruck voice. There'd be a how-to-do. There may be something in the notion, said her father thoughtfully. After all, the monster must be somewhere. This very minute he must be somewhere a-hiding of himself. Of course he's somewhere, said Mrs. Bunting scornfully. She had just heard Mr. Sleuth moving overhead. 'Twould soon be time for the lodgers' supper. She hurried on. But what I do say is that he has nothing to do with the West End. Why, they say it's a sailor from the docks. That's a good bit more likely, I take it. But there, I'm fair sick of the whole subject. We talk of nothing else in this house. The Avenger this, the Avenger that. I expect Joe has something to tell us new tonight, said Bunting cheerfully. Well, Joe, is there anything new? I say, Father, just listen to this, Daisy broke in excitedly. She read out. Bloodhounds to be seriously considered. Bloodhounds, repeated Mrs. Bunting, and there was terror in her tone. Why bloodhounds? That do seem to me a most horrible idea. Bunting looked across at her, mildly astonished. Why, 'twould be a very good idea if 'twas possible to have bloodhounds in a town. But there, how can that be done in London, full of butchers' shops, to say nothing of slaughter-yards and other places of that sort? But Daisy went on, and to her stepmother's shrinking ear there seemed a horrible thrill of delight, of gloating pleasure in her fresh young voice. Hark to this, she said. A man who had committed a murder in a lonely wood near Blackburn was traced by the help of a bloodhound, and thanks to the sagacious instincts of the animal, the miscreant was finally convicted and hanged. La, now, who'd ever have thought of such a thing? Bunting exclaimed in admiration. The newspapers do have some useful hints in sometimes, Joe. But young Chandler shook his head. Bloodhounds ain't no use, he said. No use at all. If the Yard was to listen to all the suggestions that the last few days have brought in, well, all I can say is our work would be cut out for us. Not but what it's cut out for us now, if it comes to that. He sighed ruefully. He was beginning to feel very tired. If only he could stay in this pleasant, cozy room listening to Daisy Bunting reading on and on forever, instead of having to go out, as he would presently have to do, into the cold and foggy night. Joe Chandler was fast becoming very sick of his new job. There was a lot of unpleasantness attached to the business, too. Why, even in the house where he lived and in the little cook-shop where he habitually took his meals, the people round him had taken to taunt him with the remissness of the police. More than that, one of his pals, a man he'd always looked up to because the young fellow had the gift of the gab, had actually been among those who had spoken at the big demonstration in Victoria Park, making a violent speech, not only against the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, but also against the Home Secretary. But Daisy, like most people who believe themselves blessed with the possession of an accomplishment, had no mind to leave off reading just yet. "Here's another notion!" she exclaimed. "Another letter, father!" Pardon to accomplices. Dear Sir, during the last day or two several of the more intelligent of my acquaintances have suggested that the avenger, whoever he may be, must be known to a certain number of persons. It is impossible that the perpetrator of such deeds, however nomad he may be in his habits— Now I wonder what nomad can be, Daisy interrupted herself, and looked round at her little audience. "I've always declared the fellow had all his senses about him," observed Bunting confidently. Daisy went on, quite satisfied. "However nomad he may be in his habit, he must have some habitat where his ways are known to at least one person. Now the person who knows the terrible secret is evidently withholding information in expectation of a reward, or maybe because, being an accessory after the fact, he or she is now afraid of the consequences. My suggestion, sir, is that the Home Secretary promise a free pardon. The more so that only thus can this miscreant be brought to justice. Unless he was caught red-handed in the act, it will be exceedingly difficult to trace the crime committed to any individual, for English law looks very askance at circumstantial evidence." "There's something worth listening to in that letter," said Joe, leaning forward. Now he was almost touching Daisy, and he smiled involuntarily as she turned her gay, pretty little face the better to hear what he was saying. "Yes, Mr. Chandler?" she said interrogatively. "Well, do you remember that fellow what killed an old gentleman in a railway carriage? He took refuge with someone, a woman his mother had known, and she kept him hidden for quite a long time. But at last she gave him up, and she got a big reward, too." "I don't think I'd like to give anybody up for a reward," said Bunting in his slow, dogmatic way. "Oh, yes, you would, Mr. Bunting," said Chandler confidently. "You'd only be doing what is the plain duty of everyone that is who's a good citizen, and you'd be getting something for doing it, which is more than most people gets as does their duty." "A man as gives up someone for a reward is no better than a common informer," went on Bunting obstinately, "and no man 'ud care to be called that. It's different for you, Joe," he added hastily. "It's your job to catch those who've done anything wrong. And a man'd be a fool who'd take refuge, like with you. He'd be walking into the lion's mouth." Bunting laughed. And then Daisy broke in coquettishly. "If I'd done anything, I wouldn't mind going for help to Mr. Chandler," she said. And Joe, with eyes kindling, cried, "No! And if you did, you needn't be afraid I'd give you up, Miss Daisy." And then, to their amazement, there suddenly broke from Mrs. Bunting, sitting with bowed head over the table, an exclamation of impatience and anger, and it seemed to those listening, of pain. "Why, Ellen, don't you feel well?" asked Bunting quickly. "Just a spasm, a sharp stitch in my side, like," answered the poor woman heavily. "It's over now. Don't mind me." "But I don't believe—no, that I don't—that there's anybody in the world who knows who the avenger is," went on Chandler quickly. "It stands to reason that anybody'd give him up, in their own interest, if not in anyone else's. Who'd shelter such a creature? Why, 'twould be dangerous to have him in the house along with one." "Then it's your idea that he's not responsible for the wicked things he does?" Mrs. Bunting raised her head and looked over at Chandler with eager, anxious eyes. "I'd be sorry to think he wasn't responsible enough to hang," said Chandler deliberately, "after all the trouble he's been giving us, too." "Hanging'd be too good for that chap," said Bunting. "Not if he's not responsible," said his wife sharply. "I never heard of anything so cruel. That I never did. If the man's a madman, he ought to be in an asylum. That's where he ought to be." "Hark to her, now!" Bunting looked at his Ellen with amusement. "Contrary isn't the word for her. But there, I've noticed the last few days that she seemed to be taking that monster's part. That's what comes of being a born total abstainer." Mrs. Bunting had got up from her chair. "What nonsense you do talk!" she said angrily. "Not but what it's a good thing if these murders have emptied the public houses of women for a bit. England's drink is England's shame. I'll never depart from that. Now, Daisy, child, get up, do. Put down that paper. We've heard quite enough. You could be laying the cloth while I goes down the kitchen." "Yes, you mustn't be forgetting the lodger's supper," called out Bunting. "Mr. Sleuth don't always ring." He turned to Chandler. "For one thing, he's often out about this time." "Not often, just now and again when he wants to buy something," snapped out Mrs. Bunting. "But I hadn't forgotten his supper. He never do want it before 8 o'clock." "Let me take up the lodger's supper, Ellen," Daisy's eager voice broke in. She had got up in obedience to her stepmother and was now laying the cloth. "Certainly not. I told you he only wanted me to wait on him. You have your work cut out looking after things down here. That's where I wants you to help me." Chandler also got up. Somehow he didn't like to be doing nothing while Daisy was so busy. "Yes," he said, looking across at Mrs. Bunting. "I'd forgotten about your lodger. Going on all right, eh?" "Never knew so quiet and well-behaved a gentleman," said Bunting. "He turned our luck, did Mr. Sleuth." His wife left the room, and after she had gone, Daisy laughed. "You'll hardly believe it, Mr. Chandler, but I've never seen this wonderful lodger. Ellen keeps him to herself, that she does. If I was father, I'd be jealous." Both men laughed. Ellen? No, the idea was too funny. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12. All I can say is, I think Daisy ought to go. One can't always do just what one wants to do, not in this world at any rate. Mrs. Bunting did not seem to be addressing anyone in particular, though both her husband and her stepdaughter were in the room. She was standing by the table, staring straight before her, and as she spoke she avoided looking at either Bunting or Daisy. There was in her voice a tone of cross-decision, of thin finality, with which they were both acquainted, and to which each listener knew the other would have to bow. There was silence for a moment. Then Daisy broke out passionately. "I don't see why I should go if I don't want to," she cried. "You'll allow I've been useful to you, Ellen? 'Tisn't even as if you was quite well." "I am quite well, perfectly well," snapped out Mrs. Bunting, and she turned her pale, drawn face and looked angrily at her stepdaughter. "'Tain't often I has a chance of being with you and father." There were tears in Daisy's voice, and Bunting glanced deprecatingly at his wife. An invitation had come to Daisy, an invitation from her own dead mother's sister, who was housekeeper in a big house in Belgrave Square. The family had gone away for the Christmas holidays, and Aunt Margaret, Daisy was her godchild, had begged that her niece might come and spend 2 or 3 days with her. But the girl had already had more than one taste of what life was like in the great gloomy basement of 100 Belgrave Square. Aunt Margaret was one of those old-fashioned servants for whom the modern employer is always sighing. While "the family" were away, it was her joy—she regarded it as a privilege—to wash 67 pieces of very valuable china contained in 2 cabinets in the drawing-room. She also slept in every bed by turns, to keep them all well aired. These were the 2 duties with which she intended her young niece to assist her, and Daisy's soul sickened at the prospect. But the matter had to be settled at once. The letter had come an hour ago, containing a stamped telegraph form, and Aunt Margaret was not one to be trifled with. Since breakfast the 3 had talked of nothing else, and from the very first Mrs. Bunting had said that Daisy ought to go, that there was no doubt about it, that it did not admit of discussion. But discuss it they all did, and for once Bunting stood up to his wife. But that, as was natural, only made his Ellen harder and more set on her own view. "What the child says is true," he observed. "It isn't as if you was quite well. You've been took bad twice in the last few days. You can't deny of it, Ellen. Why shouldn't I just take a bus and go over and see Margaret? I'll tell her just how it is. She'd understand, bless you." "I won't have you doing nothing of the sort," cried Mrs. Bunting, speaking almost as passionately as her stepdaughter had done. "Haven't I a right to be ill? Haven't I a right to be took bad? Aye, and to feel all right again, same as other people?" Daisy turned round and clasped her hands. "Oh, Ellen," she cried, "do say that you can't spare me. I don't want to go across to that horrid old dungeon of a place." "Do as you like," said Mrs. Bunting sullenly. "I'm fair tired of you both. There'll come a day, Daisy, when you'll know, like me, that money is the main thing that matters in this world, and when your Aunt Margaret's left her savings to somebody else just because you wouldn't spend a few days with her this Christmas, then you'll know what it's like to go without. You'll know what a fool you were, and that nothing can't alter it any more." And then, with victory actually in her grasp, poor Daisy saw it snatched from her. "Ellen is right," Bunting said heavily. "Money does matter. A terrible deal. though I never thought to hear Ellen say 'twas the only thing that mattered. But 'twould be foolish, very, very foolish, my girl, to offend your Aunt Margaret. It'll only be 2 days after all. 2 days isn't a very long time." But Daisy did not hear her father's last words. She had already rushed from the room, and gone down to the kitchen to hide her childish tears of disappointment, the childish tears which came because she was beginning to be a woman, with a woman's natural instinct for building her own human nest. Aunt Margaret was not one to tolerate the comings of any strange young man, and she had a peculiar dislike to the police. "Who'd ever have thought she'd have minded as much as that?" Bunting looked across at Ellen deprecatingly. Already his heart was misgiving him. "It's plain enough why she's become so fond of us all of a sudden," said Mrs. Bunting sarcastically, and as her husband stared at her uncomprehendingly, she added, in a tantalizing tone, "As plain as the nose on your face, my man." "What do you mean?" he said. "I dare say I'm a bit slow, Ellen, but I really don't know what you'd be at." "Don't you remember telling me before Daisy came here that Joe Chandler had become sweet on her last summer? I thought it only foolishness then, but I've come round to your view, that's all." Bunting nodded his head slowly. Yes, Joe had got into the way of coming very often, and there had been the expedition to that gruesome Scotland Yard museum, but somehow he, Bunting, had been so interested in the Avenger murders that he hadn't thought of Joe in any other connection. Not this time, at any rate. "And do you think Daisy likes him?" There was an unwonted tone of excitement, of tenderness, in Bunting's voice. His wife looked over at him, and a thin smile, not an unkindly smile by any means, lit up her pale face. "I've never been one to prophesy," she answered deliberately, "but this I don't mind telling you, Bunting. Daisy'll have plenty o' time to get tired of Joe Chandler before they two are dead. Mark my words." "Well, she might do worse," said Bunting ruminatingly. "He's as steady as God makes them, and he's already earning 32 shillings a week. But I wonder how old Aunt'd like the notion. I don't see her parting with Daisy before she must." "I wouldn't let no old aunt interfere with me about such a thing as that," cried Mrs. Bunting. "No, not for millions of gold." And Bunting looked at her in silent wonder. Ellen was singing a very different tune now to what she'd sung a few minutes ago, when she was so keen about the girl going to Belgrave Square. "If she still seems upset while she's having her dinner," said his wife suddenly, "well, you just wait till I've gone out for something, and then you just say to her, 'Absence makes the heart grow fonder,' just that and nothing more. She'll take it from you, and I shouldn't be surprised if it comforted her quite a lot." "For the matter of that, there's no reason why Joe Chandler shouldn't go over and see her there," said Bunting hesitatingly. "Oh, yes, there is," said Mrs. Bunting, smiling shrewdly. "Plenty of reason. Daisy'll be a very foolish girl if she allows her aunt to know any of her secrets. I've only seen that woman once, but I know exactly the sort Margaret is. She's just waiting for old Aunt to drop off, and then she'll want to have Daisy herself, to wait on her like. She'd turn quite nasty if she thought there was a young fellow what stood in her way." She glanced at the clock, the pretty little 8-day clock which had been a wedding present from a kind friend of her last mistress. It had mysteriously disappeared during their time of trouble, and had as mysteriously reappeared 3 or 4 days after Mr. Sleuth's arrival. "I've time to go out with that telegram," she said briskly. Somehow she felt better, different to what she had done the last few days. "And then it'll be done. It's no good having more words about it, and I expect we should have plenty more words if I wait till the child comes upstairs again." She did not speak unkindly, and Bunting looked at her rather wonderingly. Ellen very seldom spoke of Daisy as "the child." In fact, he could only remember her having done so once before, and that was a long time ago. They had been talking over their future life together, and she had said very solemnly, "Bunting, I promise I will do my duty, as much as lies in my power, that is, by the child." But Ellen had not had much opportunity of doing her duty by Daisy. As not infrequently happens with the duties that we are willing to do, that particular duty had been taken over by someone else who had no mind to let it go. "What shall I do if Mr. Sleuth rings?" asked Bunting, rather nervously. It was the first time since the lodger had come to them that Ellen had offered to go out in the morning. She hesitated. In her anxiety to have the matter of Daisy settled, she had forgotten Mr. Sleuth. Strange that she should have done so; strange, and to herself very comfortable and pleasant. "Oh, well, you can just go up and knock at the door and say I'll be back in a few minutes, that I had to go out with a message. He's quite a reasonable gentleman." She went into the back room to put on her bonnet and thick jacket, for it was very cold, getting colder every minute. As she stood, buttoning her gloves—she wouldn't have gone out untidy for the world—Bunting suddenly came across to her. "Give us a kiss, old girl," he said, and his wife turned up her face. "One'd think it was catching," she said, but there was a lilt in her voice. "So it is," Bunting briefly answered. "Didn't that old cook get married just after us? She'd never 'a thought of it if it hadn't been for you." But once she was out, walking along the damp, uneven pavement, Mr. Sleuth revenged himself for his landlady's temporary forgetfulness. During the last 2 days the lodger had been queer, odder than usual, unlike himself, or rather, very much as he had been some 10 days ago, just before that double murder had taken place. The night before, while Daisy was telling all about the dreadful place to which Joe Chandler had taken her and her father, Mrs. Bunting had heard Mr. Sleuth moving about overhead, restlessly walking up and down his sitting room. And later, when she took up his supper, she had listened a moment outside the door while he read aloud some of the texts his soul delighted in, terrible texts telling of the grim joys attendant on revenge. Mrs. Bunting was so absorbed in her thoughts, so possessed with the curious personality of her lodger, that she did not look where she was going, and suddenly a young woman bumped up against her. She started violently and looked round, dazed, as the young person muttered a word of apology. Then she again fell into deep thought. It was a good thing Daisy was going away for a few days. It made the problem of Mr. Sleuth and his queer ways less disturbing. She, Ellen, was sorry she had spoken so sharp-like to the girl, but after all it wasn't wonderful that she had been snappy. This last night she had hardly slept at all. Instead, she had lain awake listening, and there is nothing so tiring as to lie awake listening for a sound that never comes. The house had remained so still you could have heard a pin drop. Mr. Sleuth, lying snug in his nice warm bed upstairs, had not stirred. Had he stirred, his landlady was bound to have heard him, for his bed was, as we know, just above hers. No, during those long hours of darkness Daisy's light, regular breathing was all that had fallen on Mrs. Bunting's ears. And then her mind switched off Mr. Sleuth. She made a determined effort to expel him, to toss him, as it were, out of her thoughts. It seemed strange that the avenger had stayed his hand, for, as Joe had said only last evening, it was full time that he should again turn that awful, mysterious searchlight of his on himself. Mrs. Bunting always visioned the avenger as a black shadow, in the center a bright, blinding light, but the shadow had no form or definite substance. Sometimes he looked like one thing, sometimes like another. Mrs. Bunting had now come to the corner which led up the street where there was a post office, but instead of turning sharp to the left, she stopped short for a minute. There had suddenly come over her a feeling of horrible self-rebuke and even self-loathing. It was dreadful that she, of all women, should have longed to hear that another murder had been committed last night. Yet such was the shameful fact. She had listened all through breakfast hoping to hear the dread news being shouted outside. Yes, and more or less during the long discussion which had followed on the receipt of Margaret's letter she had been hoping against hope, that those dreadful triumphant shouts of the newspaper sellers still might come echoing down the Marylebone Road. And yet, hypocrite that she was, she had reproved Bunting when he had expressed, not disappointment exactly, but, well, surprise that nothing had happened last night. Now her mind switched off to Joe Chandler. Strange to think how afraid she had been of that young man. She was no longer afraid of him, or hardly at all. He was dotty. That's what was the matter with him, dotty with love for rose-cheeked, blue-eyed little Daisy. Anything might now go on, right under Joe Chandler's very nose, but bless you, he'd never see it. Last summer, when this affair, this nonsense of young Chandler and Daisy had begun, she had had very little patience with it all. In fact, the memory of the way Joe had gone on then, the tiresome way he would be always dropping in, had been one reason, though not the most important reason of all, why she had felt so terribly put about at the idea of the girl coming again. But now, well, now she had become quite tolerant, quite kindly, at any rate as far as Joe Chandler was concerned. She wondered why. Still, 'twouldn't do Joe a bit of harm not to see the girl for a couple of days. In fact, 'twould be a very good thing, for then he'd think of Daisy, think of her to the exclusion of all else. Absence does make the heart grow fonder, at first, at any rate. Mrs. Bunting was well aware of that. During the long course of hers and Bunting's mild courting, they'd been separated for about 3 months, and it was that 3 months which had made up her mind for her. She had got so used to Bunting that she couldn't do without him, and she had felt, oddest fact of all, acutely, miserably jealous. But she hadn't let him know that. No fear. Of course, Joe mustn't neglect his job. That would never do. But what a good thing it was, after all, that he wasn't like some of those detective chaps that are written about in stories, the sort of chaps that know everything, see everything, guess everything, even when there isn't anything to see or know or guess. Why, to take only one little fact, Joe Chandler had never shown the slightest curiosity about their lodger. Mrs. Bunting pulled herself together with a start, and hurried quickly on. Bunting would begin to wonder what had happened to her. She went into the post office and handed the form to the young woman without a word. Margaret, a sensible woman who was accustomed to manage other people's affairs, had even written out the words, "Will be with you to tea, Daisy." It was a comfort to have the thing settled once for all. If anything horrible was going to happen in the next 2 or 3 days, it was just as well Daisy shouldn't be at home. Not that there was any real danger that anything would happen. Mrs. Bunting felt sure of that. By this time she was out in the street again, and she began mentally counting up the number of murders the Avenger had committed. 9, or was it 10? Surely by now the Avenger must be avenged. Surely by now, if, as that writer in the newspaper had suggested, he was a quiet, blameless gentleman living in the West End, whatever vengeance he had to wreak must be satisfied. She began hurrying homewards. It wouldn't do for the lodger to ring before she had got back. Bunting would never know how to manage Mr. Sleuth, especially if Mr. Sleuth was in one of his queer moods. Mrs. Bunting put the key into the front door lock and passed into the house. Then her heart stood still with fear and terror. There came the sound of voices she thought she did not know, in the sitting room. She opened the door and then drew a long breath. It was only Joe Chandler, Joe, Daisy, and Bunting talking together. They stopped rather guiltily as she came in, but not before she had heard Chandler utter the words, "That don't mean nothing. I'll just run out and send another saying you won't come, Miss Daisy." And then the strangest smile came over Mrs. Bunting's face. There had fallen on her ear the still distant but unmistakable shouts which betokened that something had happened last night, something which made it worth while for the newspaper sellers to come crying down the Marylebone Road. "Well?" she said a little breathlessly. "Well, Joe? I suppose you've brought us news. I suppose there's been another." He looked at her, surprised. "No, that there hasn't, Mrs. Bunting, not as far as I know, that is." "Oh, you're thinking of those newspaper chaps. They've got to cry out something," he grinned. "You wouldn't have thought folk was so bloodthirsty. They're just shouting out that there's been an arrest, but we don't take no stock of that. It's a Scotchman what gave himself up last night at Dorking. He'd been drinking and was a-pitying of himself. Why, since this business began, there's been about 20 arrests, but they've all come to nothing." "Why, Ellen, you looks quite sad, quite disappointed," said Bunting jokingly. "Come to think of it, it's high time the Avenger was at work again." He laughed as he made his grim joke, then turned to young Chandler. "Well, you'll be glad when it's all over, my lad." "Glad in a way," said Chandler unwillingly. "But one 've liked to have caught him. One doesn't like to know such a creature's at large now, does one?" Mrs. Bunting had taken off her bonnet and jacket. "I must just go and see about Mr. Sleuth's breakfast," she said in a weary, dispirited voice, and left them there. She felt disappointed and very, very depressed. As to the plot which had been hatching when she came in, that had no chance of success. Bunting would never dare let Daisy send out another telegram contradicting the first. Besides, Daisy's stepmother shrewdly suspected that by now the girl herself wouldn't care to do such a thing. Daisy had plenty of sense tucked away somewhere in her pretty little head. If it ever became her fate to live as a married woman in London, it would be best to stay on the right side of Aunt Margaret. And when she came into her kitchen the stepmother's heart became very soft, for Daisy had got everything beautifully ready. In fact, there was nothing to do but to boil Mr. Sleuth's 2 eggs. Feeling suddenly more cheerful than she had felt of late, Mrs. Bunting took the tray upstairs. "As it was rather late, I didn't wait for you to ring, sir," she said. And the lodger looked up from the table where, as usual, he was studying with painful, almost agonizing intentness the book. "Quite right, Mrs. Bunting, quite right. I have been pondering over the command, 'Work while it is yet light.'" "Yes, sir?" she said, and a queer cold feeling stole over her heart. "Yes, sir?" "The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak," said Mr. Sleuth with a heavy sigh. "You studies too hard and too long, that's what's ailing you, sir," said Mr. Sleuth's landlady suddenly. When Mrs. Bunting went down again she found that a great deal had been settled in her absence. Among other things that Joe Chandler was going to escort Miss Daisy across to Belgrave Square. He could carry Daisy's modest bag, and if they wanted to ride instead of walk, why, they could take the bus from Baker Street Station to Victoria. That would land them very near Belgrave Square. But Daisy seemed quite willing to walk. She hadn't had a walk, she declared, for a long, long time. And then she blushed rosy red, and even her stepmother had to admit to herself that Daisy was very nice-looking, not at all the sort of girl who ought to be allowed to go about the London streets by herself. End of Chapter 12. Chapter 13. Daisy's father and stepmother stood side by side at the front door, watching the girl and young Chandler walk off into the darkness. A yellow pall of fog had suddenly descended on London, and Joe had come a full half-hour before they expected him, explaining, rather lamely, that it was the fog which had brought him so soon. "If we was to have waited much longer, perhaps 'twouldn't have been possible to walk a yard," he explained, and they had accepted silently his explanation. "I hope it's quite safe sending her off like that." Bunting looked deprecatingly at his wife. She had already told him more than once that he was too fussy about Daisy, that about his daughter he was like an old hen with her last chicken. "She's safer than she would be with you or me. She couldn't have a smarter young fellow to look after her." "It'll be awful thick at Hyde Park Corner," said Bunting. "It's always worse there than anywhere else. If I was Joe, I'd 'a taken her by the Underground Railway to Victoria. That'd been the best way, considering the weather 'tis." "They don't think anything of the weather, bless you," said his wife. "They'll walk and walk as long as there's a glimmer left for 'em to steer by. Daisy's just been pining to have a walk with that young chap. I wonder you didn't notice how disappointed they both were, when you was so set on going along with them to that horrid place." "Do you really mean that, Ellen?" Bunting looked upset. "I understood Joe to say he liked my company." "Oh, did you?" said Mrs. Bunting dryly. "I expect he liked it just about as much as we liked the company of that old cook who would go out with us when we was courting. It always was a wonder to me how the woman could force herself upon 2 people who didn't want her." "But I'm Daisy's father, and an old friend of Chandler," said Bunting remonstratingly. "I'm quite different from that cook. She was nothing to us, and we was nothing to her." "She'd have liked to be something to you, I make no doubt," observed his Ellen, shaking her head, and her husband smiled, a little foolishly. By this time they were back in their nice, cosy sitting-room, and a feeling of not altogether unpleasant lassitude stole over Mrs. Bunting. It was a comfort to have Daisy out of her way for a bit. The girl, in some ways, was very wide-awake and inquisitive, and she had early betrayed what her stepmother thought to be a very unseemly and silly curiosity concerning the lodger. "You might just let me have one peep at him, Ellen," she had pleaded only that morning. But Ellen had shaken her head. "No, that I won't. He's a very quiet gentleman, but he knows exactly what he likes, and he don't like anyone but me waiting on him. Why, even your father's hardly seen him." But that, naturally, had only increased Daisy's desire to view Mr. Sleuth. There was another reason why Mrs. Bunting was glad that her stepdaughter had gone away for 2 days. During her absence, young Chandler was far less likely to haunt them in the way he had taken to doing lately, the more so that, in spite of what she had said to her husband, Mrs. Bunting felt sure that Daisy would ask Joe Chandler to call at Belgrave Square. 'Twouldn't be human nature, at any rate not girlish human nature, not to do so, even if Joe's coming did anger Aunt Margaret. Yes, it was pretty safe that with Daisy away they, the Buntings, would be rid of that young chap for a bit, and that would be a good thing. When Daisy wasn't there to occupy the whole of his attention, Mrs. Bunting felt queerly afraid of Chandler. After all, he was a detective. It was his job to be always nosing about, trying to find out things. And though she couldn't fairly say to herself that he had done much of that sort of thing in her house, he might start doing it any minute. And then, where would she and Mr. Sleuth be? She thought of the bottle of red ink, of the leather bag which must be hidden somewhere, and her heart almost stopped beating. Those were the sort of things which, in the stories Bunting was so fond of reading, always led to the detection of famous criminals. Mr. Sleuth's bell for tea rang that afternoon far earlier than usual. The fog had probably misled him, and made him think it later than it was. When she went up, "I would like a cup of tea now, and just one piece of bread and butter," the lodger said wearily. "I don't feel like having anything else this afternoon." "It's a horrible day," Mrs. Bunting observed, in a cheerier voice than usual. "No wonder you don't feel hungry, sir. And then it isn't so very long since you had your dinner, is it?" "No," he said absently. "No, it isn't, Mrs. Bunting." She went down, made the tea, and brought it up again. And then, as she came into the room, she uttered an exclamation of sharp dismay. Mr. Sleuth was dressed for going out. He was wearing his long Inverness cloak, and his queer old high hat lay on the table, ready for him to put on. "You're never going out this afternoon, sir?" she asked falteringly. "Why, the fog's awful. You can't see a yard ahead of you." Unknown to herself, Mrs. Bunting's voice had risen almost to a scream. She moved back, still holding the tray, and stood between the door and her lodger, as if she meant to bar his way, to erect between Mr. Sleuth and the dark, foggy world outside a living barrier. "The weather never affects me at all," he said sullenly, and he looked at her with so wild and pleading a look in his eyes that slowly, reluctantly, she moved aside. As she did so she noticed for the first time that Mr. Sleuth held something in his right hand. It was the key of the chiffonier cupboard. He had been on his way there when her coming in had disturbed him. "It's very kind of you to be so concerned about me," he stammered. But Mrs. Bunting, you must excuse me if I say that I do not welcome such solicitude. I prefer to be left alone. I cannot stay in your house if I feel that my comings and goings are watched, spied upon." She pulled herself together. "No one spies upon you, sir," she said with considerable dignity. "I've done my best to satisfy you." "You have," he spoke in a distressed, apologetic tone. "But you spoke just now as if you were trying to prevent my doing what I wish to do, indeed what I have to do. For years I have been misunderstood, persecuted." He waited a moment, then in a hollow voice added the one word, "tortured." "Do not tell me that you are going to add yourself to the number of my tormentors, Mrs. Bunting." She stared at him helplessly. "Don't you be afraid I'll ever be that, sir. I only spoke as I did because—well, sir, because I thought it really wasn't safe for a gentleman to go out this afternoon. Why, there's hardly anyone about, though we're so near Christmas." He walked across to the window and looked out. "The fog is clearing somewhat, Mrs. Bunting." But there was no relief in his voice. Rather was there disappointment and dread. Plucking up courage, she followed him. Yes, Mr. Sleuth was right. The fog was lifting, rolling off in that sudden mysterious way in which local fogs sometimes do lift in London. He turned sharply from the window. "Our conversation has made me forget an important thing, Mrs. Bunting. I should be glad if you would just leave out a glass of milk and some bread and butter for me this evening. I shall not require supper when I come in, for after my walk I shall probably go straight upstairs to carry through a very difficult experiment." "Very good, sir," and then Mrs. Bunting left the lodger. But when she found herself downstairs in the fog-laden hall, for it had drifted in as she and her husband had stood at the door seeing Daisy off, instead of going in to Buntings she did a very odd thing, a thing she had never thought of doing in her life before. She pressed her hot forehead against the cool bit of looking-glass let into the hat and umbrella stand. "I don't know what to do," she moaned to herself, and then, "I can't bear it, I can't bear it." But though she felt that her secret suspense and trouble was becoming intolerable, the one way in which she could have ended her misery never occurred to Mrs. Bunting. In the long history of crime it has very, very seldom happened that a woman has betrayed one who has taken refuge with her. The timorous and cautious woman has not infrequently hunted a human being fleeing from his pursuer from her door, but she has not revealed the fact that he was ever there. In fact, it may almost be said that such betrayal has never taken place unless the betrayer has been actuated by love of gain or by a longing for revenge. So far, perhaps because she is subject rather than citizen, her duty as a component part of civilized society weighs but lightly on woman's shoulders. And then, in a sort of way, Mrs. Bunting had become attached to Mr. Sleuth. A wan smile would sometimes light up his sad face when he saw her come in with one of his meals, and when this happened Mrs. Bunting felt pleased and vaguely touched. In between those dreadful events outside, which filled her with such suspicion, such anguish, and such suspense, she never felt any fear, only pity for Mr. Sleuth. Often and often, when lying wide awake at night, she turned over the strange problem in her mind. After all, the lodger must have lived somewhere during his 40-odd years of life. She did not even know if Mr. Sleuth had any brothers or sisters. Friends she knew he had none. But however odd and eccentric he was, he had evidently, or so she supposed, led a quiet, undistinguished kind of life, till now. What had made him alter all of a sudden, if, that is, he had altered? That was what Mrs. Bunting was always debating fitfully with herself. And what was more, and very terribly to the point, having altered, why should he not in time go back to what he evidently had been, that is, a blameless, quiet gentleman? If only he would! If only he would! As she stood in the hall, cooling her hot forehead, all these thoughts, these hopes and fears, jostled at lightning speed through her brain. She remembered what young Chandler had said the other day, that there had never been in the history of the world so strange a murderer as the Avenger had proved himself to be. She and Bunting, ay, and little Daisy, too, had hung fascinated on Joe's words, as he had told them of other famous series of murders which had taken place in the past, not only in England but abroad, especially abroad. One woman, whom all the people round her believed to be a kind, respectable soul, had poisoned no fewer than 15 people in order to get their insurance money. Then there had been the terrible tale of an apparently respectable, contented innkeeper and his wife, who, living at the entrance to a wood, killed all those humble travellers who took shelter under their roof, simply for their clothes and any valuables they possessed. But in all those stories, the murderer, or murderers, always had a very strong motive, the motive being, in almost every case, a wicked lust for gold. At last, after having passed her handkerchief over her forehead, she went into the room where Bunting was sitting smoking his pipe. "The fog's lifting a bit," she said in an ill-assured voice. "I hope that by this time Daisy and that Joe Chandler are right out of it." But the other shook his head silently. "No such luck," he said briefly. "You don't know what it's like in Hyde Park, Ellen. I expect 'twill soon be just as heavy here as 'twas half an hour ago." She wandered over to the window and pulled the curtain back. "Quite a lot of people have come out anyway," she observed. "There's a fine Christmas show in the Edgware Road. I was thinking of asking if you wouldn't like to go along there with me." "No," she said dully. "I'm quite content to stay at home." She was listening for the sounds which would betoken that the lodger was coming downstairs. At last she heard the cautious, selfless tread of his rubber-soled shoes shuffling along the hall, but Bunting only woke to the fact when the front door shut to. "That's never Mr. Sleuth going out?" He turned on his wife, startled. "Why, the poor gentleman'll come to harm, that he will. One has to be wide awake on an evening like this. I hope he hasn't taken any of his money out with him." "'Tisn't the first time Mr. Sleuth's been out in a fog," said Mrs. Bunting somberly. Somehow she couldn't help uttering these overtrue words. And then she turned, eager and half frightened, to see how Bunting had taken what she said. But he looked quite placid, as if he had hardly heard her. "We don't get the good old fogs we used to get. Not what people used to call London particulars. I expect the lodger feels like Mrs. Crowley. I've often told you about her, Ellen?" Mrs. Bunting nodded. Mrs. Crowley had been one of Bunting's ladies, one of those he had liked best, a cheerful, jolly lady who used often to give her servants what she called a treat. It was seldom the kind of treat they would have chosen for themselves, but still they appreciated her kind thought. "Mrs. Crowley used to say," went on Bunting, in his slow, dogmatic way, "that she never minded how bad the weather was in London, so long as it was London and not the country. Mr. Crowley, he liked the country best, but Mrs. Crowley always felt dull-like there. Fog never kept her from going out, no, that it didn't. She wasn't a bit afraid. But," he turned round and looked at his wife, "I am a bit surprised at Mr. Sleuth. I should have thought him a timid kind of gentleman." He waited a moment, and she felt forced to answer him. "I wouldn't exactly call him timid," she said in a low voice, "but he is very quiet, certainly. That's why he dislikes going out when there are a lot of people bustling about the streets. I don't suppose he'll be out long." She hoped with all her soul that Mr. Sleuth would be in very soon, that he would be daunted by the now increasing gloom. Somehow she did not feel she could sit still for very long. She got up and went over to the farthest window. The fog had lifted, certainly. She could see the lamplights on the other side of the Marylebone Road, glimmering redly, and shadowy figures were hurrying past, mostly making their way towards the Edgware Road, to see the Christmas shops. At last, to his wife's relief, Bunting got up too. He went over to the cupboard where he kept his little store of books and took one out. "I think I'll read a bit," he said. "Seems a long time since I've looked at a book. The papers was so jolly interesting for a bit, but now there's nothing in 'em." His wife remained silent. She knew what he meant. A good many days had gone by since the last two Avenger murders, and the papers had very little to say about them that they hadn't said in different language a dozen times before. She went into her bedroom and came back with a bit of plain sewing. Mrs. Bunting was fond of sewing, and Bunting liked to see her so engaged. Since Mr. Sleuth had come to be their lodger she had not had much time for that sort of work. It was funny how quiet the house was without either Daisy or the lodger in it. At last she let her needle remain idle, and the bit of cambric slipped down on her knee, while she listened, longingly, for Mr. Sleuth's return home. And as the minutes sped by she fell to wondering with a painful wonder if she would ever see her lodger again, for, from what she knew of Mr. Sleuth, Mrs. Bunting felt sure that if he got into any kind of, well, trouble outside, he would never betray where he had lived during the last few weeks. No, in such a case the lodger would disappear in as sudden a way as he had come, and Bunting would never suspect, would never know, until perhaps—God, what a horrible thought!—a picture published in some newspaper might bring a certain dreadful fact to Bunting's knowledge. But if that happened, if that unthinkably awful thing came to pass, she made up her mind, here and now, never to say anything. She also would pretend to be amazed, shocked, unutterably horrified at the astounding revelation. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14. "There he is at last, and I'm glad of it, Ellen. 'Tain't a night you would wish a dog to be out in." Bunting's voice was full of relief, but he did not turn round and look at his wife as he spoke. Instead, he continued to read the evening paper he held in his hand. He was still close to the fire, sitting back comfortably in his nice arm-chair. He looked very well and ruddy. Mrs. Bunting stared across at him with a touch of sharp envy, nay, more of resentment. And this was very curious, for she was, in her own dry way, very fond of Bunting. "You needn't feel so nervous about him. Mr. Sleuth can look out for himself all right." Bunting laid the paper he had been reading down on his knee. "I can't think why he wanted to go out in such weather," he said impatiently. "Well, it's none of your business, Bunting, now is it?" "No, that's true enough. Still, 'twould be a very bad thing for us if anything happened to him. This lodger's the first bit of luck we've had for a terrible long time, Ellen." Mrs. Bunting moved a little impatiently in her high chair. She remained silent for a moment. What Bunting had said was too obvious to be worth answering. Also she was listening, following in imagination her lodger's quick, singularly quiet progress. Stealthy, she called it to herself, through the fog-filled, lamp-lit hall. Yes, now he was going up the staircase. What was it that Bunting was saying? "It isn't safe for decent folk to be out in such weather. No, that it ain't. Not unless they have something to do that won't wait till tomorrow." The speaker was looking straight into his wife's narrow, colourless face. Bunting was an obstinate man, and liked to prove himself right. "I've a good mind to speak to him about it, that I have. He ought to be told that it isn't safe, not for the sort of man he is, to be wandering about the streets at night. I read you about the accidents in Lloyd's. Shocking they were, and all brought about by the fog. And then that horrid monster'll soon be at his work again." "Monster?" repeated Mrs. Bunting absently. She was trying to hear the lodger's footsteps overhead. She was very curious to know whether he had gone into his nice sitting-room, or straight upstairs, to that cold experiment room, as he now always called it. But her husband went on as if he had not heard her, and she gave up trying to listen to what was going on above. "It wouldn't be very pleasant to run up against such a party as that in the fog, eh, Ellen?" He spoke as if the notion had a certain pleasant thrill in it after all. "What stuff you do talk!" said Mrs. Bunting sharply, and then she got up. Her husband's remarks had disturbed her. Why couldn't they talk of something pleasant when they did have a quiet bit of time together? Bunting looked down again in his paper, and she moved quietly about the room. Very soon it would be time for supper, and tonight she was going to cook her husband a nice piece of toasted cheese. That fortunate man, as she was fond of telling him, with mingled contempt and envy, had the digestion of an ostrich, and yet he was rather fanciful, as gentlemen's servants who have lived in good places often are. Yes, Bunting was very lucky in the matter of his digestion. Mrs. Bunting prided herself on having a nice mind, and she would never have allowed an unrefined word, such a word as stomach, for instance, to say nothing of an even plainer term, to pass her lips, except, of course, to a doctor in a sick-room. Mr. Sleuth's landlady did not go down at once into her cold kitchen. Instead, with a sudden furtive movement, she opened the door leading into her bedroom, and then, closing the door quietly, stepped back into the darkness, and stood motionless, listening. At first she heard nothing, but gradually there stole on her listening ears the sound of someone moving softly about in the room just overhead, that is, in Mr. Sleuth's bedroom. But try as she might, it was impossible for her to guess what the lodger was doing. At last she heard him open the door leading out on the little landing. She could hear the stairs creaking. That meant no doubt that Mr. Sleuth would pass the rest of the evening in the cheerless room above. He hadn't spent any time up there for quite a long while. In fact, not for nearly 10 days. 'Twas odd he chose tonight, when it was so foggy, to carry out an experiment. She groped her way to a chair and sat down. She felt very tired, strangely tired, as if she had gone through some great physical exertion. Yes, it was true that Mr. Sleuth had brought her and Bunting luck, and it was wrong, very wrong, of her ever to forget that. As she sat there she also reminded herself, and not for the first time, what the lodger's departure would mean. It would almost certainly mean ruin, just as his staying meant all sorts of good things, of which physical comfort was the least. If Mr. Sleuth stayed on with them, as he showed every intention of doing, it meant respectability, and, above all, security. Mrs. Bunting thought of Mr. Sleuth's money. He never received a letter, and yet he must have some kind of income, so much was clear. She supposed he went and drew his money, in sovereigns, out of a bank as he required it. Her mind swung round, consciously, deliberately, away from Mr. Sleuth. The Avenger. What a strange name! Again she assured herself that there would come a time when the Avenger, whoever he was, must feel satiated, when he would feel himself to be, so to speak, avenged. To go back to Mr. Sleuth. It was lucky that the lodger seemed so pleased, not only with the rooms, but with his landlord and landlady. Indeed, there was no real reason why Mr. Sleuth should ever wish to leave such nice lodgings. Mrs. Bunting suddenly stood up. She made a strong effort, and shook off her awful sense of apprehension and unease. Feeling for the handle of the door giving into the passage, she turned it, and then, with light, firm steps, she went down into the kitchen. When they had first taken the house, the basement had been made by her care, if not into a pleasant, then at any rate into a very clean place. She had had it whitewashed, and against the still white walls the gas stove loomed up, a great square of black iron and bright steel. It was a large gas stove, the kind for which one pays 4 shillings a quarter rent to the gas company, and here, in the kitchen, there was no foolish shilling-in-the-slot arrangement. Mrs. Bunting was too shrewd a woman to have anything to do with that kind of business. There was a proper gas meter, and she paid for what she consumed after she had consumed it. Putting her candle down on the well-scrubbed wooden table, she turned up the gas jet and blew out the candle. Then, lighting one of the gas rings, she put a frying-pan on the stove, and once more her mind reverted, as if in spite of herself, to Mr. Sleuth. Never had there been a more confiding or trusting gentleman than the lodger, and yet in some ways he was so secret, so peculiar. She thought of the bag, that bag which had rumbled about so queerly in the chiffonier. Something seemed to tell her that tonight the lodger had taken that bag out with him. And then she thrust away the thought of the bag almost violently from her mind, and went back to the more agreeable thought of Mr. Sleuth's income, and of how little trouble he gave. Of course, the lodger was eccentric, otherwise he wouldn't be their lodger at all. He would be living in quite a different sort of way with some of his relations, or with a friend in his own class. While these thoughts galloped disconnectedly through her mind, Mrs. Bunting went on with her cooking, preparing the cheese, cutting it up into little shreds, carefully measuring out the butter, doing everything, as was always her way, with a certain delicate and cleanly precision. And then, while in the middle of toasting the bread on which was to be poured the melted cheese, she suddenly heard sounds which startled her, made her feel uncomfortable. Shuffling, hesitating steps were creaking down the house. She looked up and listened. Surely the lodger was not going out again into the cold and foggy night, going out, as he had done the other evening, for a second time. But no, the sounds she heard, the sounds of now familiar footsteps, did not continue down the passage leading to the front door. Instead, why, what was this she heard now? She began to listen so intently that the bread she was holding at the end of the toasting fork grew quite black. With a start she became aware that this was so, and she frowned, vexed with herself. That came of not attending to one's work. Mr. Sleuth was evidently about to do what he had never yet done. He was coming down into the kitchen. Nearer and nearer came the thudding sounds, treading heavily on the kitchen stairs, and Mrs. Bunting's heart began to beat as if in response. She put out the flame of the gas ring, unheedful of the fact that the cheese would stiffen and spoil in the cold air. Then she turned and faced the door. There came a fumbling at the handle, and a moment later the door opened, and revealed, as she had at once known and feared it would do, the lodger. Mr. Sleuth looked even odder than usual. He was clad in a plaid dressing-gown, which she had never seen him wear before, though she knew that he had purchased it not long after his arrival. In his hand was a lighted candle. When he saw the kitchen all lighted up, and the woman standing in it, the lodger looked inexplicably taken aback, almost aghast. "Yes, sir. What can I do for you, sir? I hope you didn't ring, sir." Mrs. Bunting held her ground in front of the stove. Mr. Sleuth had no business to come like this into her kitchen, and she intended to let him know that such was her view. "No, I didn't ring," he stammered awkwardly. "The truth is, I didn't know you were here, Mrs. Bunting. Please excuse my costume. My gas stove has gone wrong, or rather that shilling-in-the-slot arrangement has done so. So I came down to see if you had a gas stove. I'm going to ask you to allow me to use it tonight for an important experiment I wish to make." Mrs. Bunting's heart was beating quickly, quickly. She felt horribly troubled, unnaturally so. Why couldn't Mr. Sleuth's experiment wait till the morning? She stared at him dubiously, but there was that in his face that made her at once afraid and pitiful. It was a wild, eager, imploring look. "Oh, certainly, sir, but you will find it very cold down here." "It seems most pleasantly warm," he observed, his voice full of relief. "Warm and cozy after my cold room upstairs." Warm and cozy? Mrs. Bunting stared at him in amazement. Nay, even that cheerless room at the top of the house must be far warmer and more cozy than this cold underground kitchen could possibly be. "I'll make you a fire, sir. We never use the grate, but it's in perfect order, for the first thing I did after I came into the house was to have the chimney swept. It was terribly dirty. It might have set the house on fire." Mrs. Bunting's housewifely instincts were roused. "For the matter of that, you ought to have a fire in your bedroom this cold night." "By no means. I would prefer not. I certainly do not want a fire there. I dislike an open fire, Mrs. Bunting. I thought I had told you as much." Mr. Sleuth frowned. He stood there, a strange-looking figure, his candle still alight, just inside the kitchen door. "I shan't be very long, sir. Just about a quarter of an hour. You could come down then. I'll have everything quite tidy for you. Is there anything I can do to help you?" "I do not require the use of your kitchen yet, thank you all the same, Mrs. Bunting. I shall come down later, altogether later, after you and your husband have gone to bed. But I should be much obliged if you would see that the gas people come tomorrow and put my stove in order. It might be done while I am out. That the shilling in the slot machine should go wrong is very unpleasant. It has upset me greatly." "Perhaps Bunting could put it right for you, sir. For the matter of that, I could ask him to go up now." "No, no, I don't want anything of that sort done tonight. Besides, he couldn't put it right. I am something of an expert, Mrs. Bunting, and I have done all I could. The cause of the trouble is quite simple. The machine is choked up with shillings, a very foolish plan, so I always felt it to be." Mr. Sleuth spoke pettishly, with far more heat than he was wont to speak, but Mrs. Bunting sympathized with him in this matter. She had always suspected that those slot machines were as dishonest as if they were human. It was dreadful the way they swallowed up the shillings. She had had one once, so she knew. And as if he were divining her thoughts, Mr. Sleuth walked forward and stared at the stove. "Then you haven't got a slot machine?" he said wonderingly. "I'm very glad of that, for I expect my experiment will take some time. But of course I shall pay you something for the use of the stove, Mrs. Bunting." "Oh, no, sir. I wouldn't think of charging you anything for that. We don't use our stove very much, you know, sir. I'm never in the kitchen a minute longer than I can help this cold weather." Mrs. Bunting was beginning to feel better. When she was actually in Mr. Sleuth's presence, her morbid fears would be lulled, perhaps because his manner almost invariably was gentle and very quiet. But still there came over her an eerie feeling, as with him preceding her, they made a slow progress to the ground floor. Once there, the lodger courteously bade his landlady good night, and proceeded upstairs to his own apartments. Mrs. Bunting returned to the kitchen. Again she lighted the stove, but she felt unnerved, afraid of she knew not what. As she was cooking the cheese, she tried to concentrate her mind on what she was doing, and on the whole she succeeded. But another part of her mind seemed to be working independently, asking her insistent questions. The place seemed to her alive with alien presences, and once she caught herself listening, which was absurd, for of course she could not hope to hear what Mr. Sleuth was doing 2, if not 3 flights upstairs. She wondered in what the lodger's experiments consisted. It was odd that she had never been able to discover what it was he really did with that big gas stove. All she knew was that he used a very high degree of heat. End of chapter 14. Recording by Leanne Howlett.